Before Rome carved its name into stone, before its legions marched and Latin shaped the world, there was another age older, stranger, half lost to time. The Mediterranean was already a cradle of kingdoms, where empires flickered like flame and myths walked beside men. In the entire story of the Roman Empire, we begin not with Caesar or conquest, but in the torchlit world that came before, a world whose echoes shaped the empire to come. Step back into the deep shadows of the Bronze Age, where the story truly begins. To the east, mighty Egypt stood stoic along the Nile, her temples already centuries old, her kings wrapped in linen and mystery. Across the sea, Mesopotamia hummed with the rhythm of cities and scribes, where gods watched from ziggurats and rivers decided fate. And in the Aegean, the Mycenaeans carved palaces into hillsides, their warriors armed with bronze, and their dreams echoing in epic verse. This was a world already old, when Rome was but soil and stone, waiting. Yet in the shadowed west, beyond the reach of scrolls and scribes, lay the Italian peninsula wild, forested, and fiercely alive. It was not empty, far from it. Here, the land stirred with peoples who left no histories, only echoes. They built huts on high ground, shaped tools from stone, then copper, then bronze. They honored their dead with care, burying them in round barrows or long stone tombs, hinting at beliefs now long forgotten. They carved out lives among the rivers and ridges, clustered in tribal groups that would one day lend their names to legends. These were the ancestors of the Latins, the Umbrians, the Sabines' names whispered by history, half remembered. To the north, the Etruscans began to rise, shrouded in mystery, their language still resisting full translation. Skilled metalworkers and seafarers, their influence would stretch southward like smoke before fire. Long before Rome bore a crown or a sword, trade crept along the coastlines like a slow tide. Phoenician ships, narrow and swift, brought exotic goods from the Levant to unknown western shores. Amber from the north, tin from Britain, ivory, spices, and tales. Everywhere, a quiet web of commerce and contact began to link these distant peoples, drawing them into a single breath before history would speak clearly. The Italian landscape itself shaped destinies. Rugged mountains ran like spines through the land, separating valleys from valleys, people from people. Rivers carved paths through forest and field, their waters dark and full of memory. Volcanic soil gave richness to the harvests, while earthquakes reminded all who lived there that the gods saw the earth could never be ignored. This was the world before Rome, a land of murmurs and movement, of small things becoming great. In this quiet dawn, the future empire was still a promise folded in the hills, a breath held by the land itself, waiting for its time to be spoken aloud. Long before the Senate rose and the legions marched, Rome dreamed itself into being, and at the heart of that dream walked a man with fire at his back and a burden in his arms, Aeneas, son of Venus, prince of ruined Troy. His story is not history, not in the way of dates and documents, but in the quiet pulse of myth. It is as real as the stones that would someday shape the Forum. Troy had burned. The once golden city fell to ash beneath Greek swords, her towers crumbling as fire licked the sky. From the smoke walked Aeneas, not in triumph, but in survival, carrying his aged father on his shoulders, holding his young son's hand. He stepped into exile with the weight of a lost world behind him. The gods had spared him not for comfort, but for destiny. He was not to rebuild Troy. He was to build something greater. The voyage of Aeneas stretched long and bitter. Across storm-lashed seas and foreign shores, he sought the land the gods had promised, a place not yet born, where his descendants would one day rule all nations. He wandered to Carthage, where Queen Dido's love threatened to hold him fast, but the gods whispered, and duty called. He left her on a lonely pyre, and her curse would echo for centuries. Finally, the winds carried him to the shores of Italy, to Latium, where old kings ruled and old gods watched. It was not peace he found, but war once more. The land resisted him, as all new beginnings do. But Aeneas did not come to conquer, he came to fulfill. He made alliances, fought battles, and carved a place for his people. The gods demanded blood and sacrifice, and Aeneas gave both. His final duel with Turnus, the native prince, ended not with mercy, but with fate fulfilled. The sword struck deep, and the future opened. From Aeneas would come the line of Alban kings, and from that line, in time, Romulus and Remus. But Aeneas himself would not see Rome. He was not meant to. He was the seed, not the tree. His story, told by poets and prophets, wove divine purpose into the very soil of Roman identity. Rome was not an accident, it was foretold. Willed by the heavens, born in grief, forged by wanderers. Through Aeneas, Rome could claim not just ancestry, but destiny. The Trojan hero gave her a past, as noble as her ambitions were vast. And so, in the hush before the empire, the tale of Aeneas lingers. A story told by firelight, passed from lips to scrolls, from scrolls to memory. A myth, yes, but one that shaped the minds of men who would one day rule the world. Before columns rose from the earth and banners flew above the 7 hills, there was only silence and soil, broken by the cries of 2 infants left to die. Romulus and Remus twins born of blood, betrayal, and prophesy floated helpless in the reeds of the Tiber, heirs to a kingdom that did not yet exist. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin, sworn to chastity, but claimed by the god Mars. Her sons were not merely royalthe, were divine, but the world is rarely kind to sacred things. The usurper Amulius, fearing prophecy and power, ordered the newborns drowned. Yet the river carried them not to death, but to destiny. Washed ashore beneath a fig tree on the Palatine hill, the twins were found by a she-wolf. Not the monster of fangs and fear, but a mother ancient, primal, fierce. She suckled them, nursed them, guarded their sleep in a den carved from rock. The wolf became a symbol, wild and unbreakable, as if the land itself had chosen them. Later, a shepherd and his wife raised the boys, never knowing their bloodline. They grew into strong young men, bold and brimming with fire, leading bands of outlaws, challenging kings, shaking the roots of the old world. And in time, the truth surfaced. They were not peasants, they were princes. With their grandfather Numitor restored to the throne of Alba Longa, the twins turned their eyes to a new task, not reclaiming an old kingdom, but building a new one. They searched for the perfect place. A hill, a river, a future. The Palatine called to them, where the she-wolf had first offered life. But even brothers, even twins, cannot always share a vision. Dispute turned to argument. Argument turned to rage. Remus mocked Romulus's walls, stepping over them in jest. But Romulus was building more than stone. He was building sovereignty. He struck down his brother, and the earth drank the first blood of a city not yet born. With that act terrible, tragic, necessary Rome began. Not with speeches or treaties, but with sacrifice and solitude. Romulus named the city after himself, drew its boundaries with plough and prayer, and opened its gates to all. Fugitives, freedmen, wanderers, a refuge for the unwanted, a home for the bold. He ruled as Rome's first king, shaping its laws and calling its gods. And then, as legends tell, he vanished in a storm, lifted to the heavens, made divine. The Romans would worship him as Quirinus, a god born from a man who had been a wolf's child, a brother, a murderer, and a king. In the hush of the Roman twilight, his story Endurisa, whisper on the wind that still lingers over the Palatine, where a city once rose from the cry of infants and the howl of wolves. After Romulus vanished into myth, Rome stood not as a city, but as a question. Stone walls traced its outline, and wild hills cradled its form, but it had no shape of the soul not yet. That shaping would fall to the kings, 7 in all, each one laying another stone not just in Rome's streets, but in its memory. The first king was Romulus, fierce and proud. He gave Rome her name, her weapons, her spirit of defiance. He carved laws into custom, summoned the Senate, and filled his city with the cast-offs of other lands' outlaws, slaves, wanderers, those with nothing left to lose. Then he took wives for his people by force, seizing the Sabine women in a festival-turned frenzy, forging kinship out of violence and reconciliation. It was a rough birth, but Rome never pretended to be gentle. Numa Pompilius followed, a Sabine, a peacemaker. Where Romulus ruled by the sword, Numa ruled by the sacred. He spoke with the gods, or so the people believed, through the nymph, Aegean, in the quiet groves. He brought temples, priests, and rituals that measured time like breath calm, steady, unbroken. Under Numa, the Romans learned that order could come not only from force, but from rhythm and reverence. Tullus Hostilius shattered that calm. A warrior to the core, he reignited Rome's hunger for conquest. Alba Longa fell by his hand, not through overwhelming force, but through ritualized violence triplets from each city, champions of fate, fighting in the name of survival. When Tullus dared the gods in arrogance, lightning found him, and Rome remembered what happened to those who thought themselves divine. Ancus Marcius blended the past. A grandson of Numa, he knew the value of piety, but he also knew the call of the sword. He built Rome's first prison, its first bridge over the Tiber, and pushed the city toward the sea. With him came salt air, trade winds, and the idea that Rome might stretch beyond its hills. Then came the kings from elsewhere. Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan, brought wealth and spectacle chariots, games, arches, and ivory. Rome watched itself become more than rustic. Under him, the Circus Maximus echoed with hoofbeats and cheers. Servius Tullius, born a slave, crowned by flame, gave Rome its census, its classes, its sense of who stood where. He wrapped the hills with walls and called Rome not a city, but a people. His vision was wide, his reforms lasting, but vision breeds envy. The last king was Tarquinius Superbus Tarquin the Proud. He ruled by fear and fell by fury. His son's cruelty toward a noblewoman named Lucretia ignited a fire Rome could not put out. Kingship, so long the backbone of order, was cast off with shouts for liberty, yet from each king something remained. Rituals, roads, stories. Their names faded into legend, but their works shaped a city that would someday shape the world. The monarchy died, but the memory endured etched into stone, law, and the Roman soul. The kings had ruled for generations, their shadows long over the valleys and hills. They had given Rome temples and walls, festivals and laws, but by the end, the crown had grown too heavy, its weight crushing the soul of the people beneath it. Power, once worn with reverence, had become armor-hardened, inflexible, and blind. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, wore it proudly. They called him Tarquin the Proud, not for his grandeur, but for the arrogance that clung to him like a second skin. He silenced the Senate, ruled without counsel, and trusted only the sword. He expanded Rome's reach, yes, but at the cost of fear. His enemies vanished in chains or blood. His temples were built by forced hands. The crown no longer rested on a head it pressed down like a curse. But it was not conquest or cruelty that broke the monarchy. It was shame. Lucretia was the wife of a nobleman, known for her virtue, untouched by scandal. Tarquin's son, Sextus, driven not by love but by entitlement, entered her chamber with violence and left her with silence. Lucretia, unable to bear the stain he forced upon her, gathered her kinsmen, spoke her truth, and took her own life with a dagger pressed to her breast. Her blood spilled not only on the floor, but across Rome's future. That act shattered the silence. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus once, thought slow-witted, now sharp with purpose, arose to avenge her and to end what the kings had become. He lifted the blade and called the people to rise, not just against a man, but against the very idea of monarchy. The revolt was swift and unrelenting. Tarquin fled, his throne empty behind him. No king would ever sit there again. In place of one ruler came two, consuls, chosen by the people, limited by law, balanced by time. Their power was great, but not eternal. 1 year. That was all. The idea was not perfection, but prevention. Never again would one man rise too far above the others. The Republic was born, not in theory, but in fury. Brutus himself would pay the price. When his own sons conspired to restore the monarchy, he sentenced them to death. He watched the execution with dry eyes, proving that no blood linen knot, even his own, stood above the law. The Republic was sacred. It would be defended not by walls, but by principle. The fall of the kings did not erase their legacy. Their temples still stood. Their roads were still walked. But the people had claimed something greater than land or lineage, the right to govern themselves. And though storms would come, and tyrants would rise again in new forms and new names, the Roman soul had changed. The crown was broken. The people, now sovereign, had found their voice. And that voice would echo for centuries. The king was gone, his shadow scattered by the cries of the people and the clang of revolution. But a city cannot live on anger alone. Rome, newly free, stood at the edge of a question. What would come next? The silence left by monarchy was deep, but into that silence stepped something older than any crown order. At the heart of it was the Senate, a body not newly born but reborn. Once an advisory circle to kings, it now rose as the soul of the state. Patres, the fathers of Rome, men whose lineage traced back to the earliest days, filled its rows. They debated beneath the open sky in the Comitium, robes gathered, voices raised, not for power's sake alone, but for the shaping of a world without a king. They did not govern directly, they guided. Not rulers, but stewards of the Republic's soul. To hold power, the people turned to a new creation, the consulship. 2 men, equal in authority, chosen not by blood, but by vote. Each held imperium, the sacred, right to command, but only for a year, a single turn of the seasons. Power held briefly, passed on like breath. If one consul faltered, the other could block him. It was balance, not dominance. Where a king had ruled alone, now 2 walked side by side, bound by time, law, and the memory of tyranny. The first consuls were Brutus and Collatinus, chosen in the wake of revolution. But Collatinus bore the name of Tarquin, and even the scent of monarchy was too much. He stepped down, exiled by memory more than law. Rome would not forget easily. The Republic was fragile, more hope than reality in those early years. Factions clashed, patricians guarded their privileges, and the plebeians, the common people, watched from outside the gates of power. Still, the scaffolding held. Magistrates were elected. Assemblies were summoned. Laws, once the whisper of kings, became the voice of citizens. Crises came, and with them, the dictator. Not the tyrant we hear in the word now, but a temporary guardian-known man given total power, but only for 6 months. He was a shield, not a crown, called only when survival demanded swift hands and single minds. And when the danger passed, the dictator stepped down. The people expected it. The Republic demanded it. In this new order, Rome began to stretch. Not yet an empire, but no longer just a city of hills and hearths. The Republic became a rhythm: vote, serve, yield, rise, rule, retire. Ambition found structure. Tradition held it in check. It was not a democracy as we know it. Power rested with the few, guided by ancestry and wealth. But the seed had been planted that the state belonged not to one, but to many. And from that seed, Rome would grow. In the hush after revolution, the Republic did not shout. It breathed, quiet, steady, resilient. A new kind of power had entered the world, not born in a palace, but in the streets, not given by gods, but entrusted by men. Rome had shed its kings, but not its chains. The Republic, for all its promise, did not rise in perfect balance. Beneath the robes of liberty, old divides still festered. The city was free, yes, but not equal. At the summit stood the patricians, ancient families, with names older than the Republic itself. They held the consulships, sat in the Senate, and spoke with the weight of tradition behind every word. Below them stood the plebeians, the many farmers, craftsmen, labourers, soldiers who built the roads, tilled the fields, and filled the ranks of Rome's armies, yet held no share in the power they defended. The divide was not merely social, it was legal, spiritual, woven into the very bones of the state. Only patricians could hold high office, interpret sacred law, or serve as priests. The plebeians could fight and die for Rome, but they could not speak for it. They could be punished, but not heard. That silence would not last. The first cry came not with violence, but with absence. In the early days of the Republic, the plebeians simply walked away. They left the city, withdrew to the sacred mount, and refused to return until their voices were recognized. No blades drawn, no walls stormedly the echo of a city without its people. Rome, hollow and frightened, gave in. From that standoff rose the tribune of the plebs, an office born not from tradition but necessity. These tribunes, 10 in number, held one power above all, the right to veto. A single word from them, I forbid it, could stop any action cold. They were the guardians of the people, sacrosanct, untouchable, chosen from those who had once been voiceless. But the fight was not over. The laws of Rome remained secret, hidden behind patrician interpretation and priestly privilege. Justice was arbitrary, rights unclear. The plebeians demanded light. And so, reluctantly, the Senate agreed to inscribe the law literally. A commission was formed, and the laws were carved onto 12 bronze tablets, displayed in the forum for all to see. The 12 tables, they were crude by later standards, harsh and incomplete, but they marked a beginning. Rome had moved from custom to code. Still, the struggle surged forward. The plebeians pushed for access to consulships, intermarriage with patricians, equal footing in the courts. Every gain was hard won, every concession fought through protests, secessions, and years of negotiation. The Republic bent, but did not break. Through it all, Rome endured. Not because it was just, but because it listened slowly, grudgingly, painfully to those it had once silenced. The struggle of the orders was not a revolution. It was a negotiation stretched over centuries. A constant reminder that even in the city of laws, law itself must grow. In the dusty forum where soldiers passed and traders haggled, bronze tablets stood silent, but their silence spoke volumes. They told a story not of nobles or gods, but of common people refusing to be forgotten. Rome, still young by the measure of empires, stood restless within her walls. She had cast off kings, survived her own growing pains, and carved law into bronze. But she was not made to stay still. Her destiny lay outward, in the hills and valleys beyond the Tiber, where other peoples lived, fought, and dreamed beneath the same sun. Expansion did not come from desire alone, it came from necessity. Rome needed land for her farmers, security for her trade, and prestige for her ambition. And Italy, fractured and full of rivals, was waiting. The peninsula was no blank map. It was a mosaic of tribes and towns, alliances and enmities. The Etruscans to the north, fading now but still proud. The Greeks to the south, in rich cities that spoke with the voice of Homer. Between them lay the Samnites fierce, mountain-born warriors, who fought not in phalanx, but in scattered, agile bands. They lived high and free, and they would not kneel easily. The wars began not with conquest, but with collision. Rome's influence spread quietly at first alliances, roads, colonies laid like threads. But threads become webs, and webs catch. The Samnites felt the tightening and struck back. What followed was a series of 3 wars, long and bitter, that would span nearly half a century. It was not one campaign, but many battles lost and won, treaties signed and shattered, cities taken and retaken. In the early days, Rome faltered. The Caudine Forks burned deep in memory. Roman legions, trapped in a narrow pass, were forced to surrender without a fight. They marched home beneath the yoke-to spears upright, one across, a ritual of humiliation. Rome had tasted defeat before, but not like this. The sting did not break. Herod steeled her. New strategies followed. Roads stretched into the hills, binding allies together. Fortified colonies appeared like anchors dropped into hostile land. Rome learned to fight the Samnite way quick, flexible, relentless. And the legions grew stronger, more disciplined, less reliant on old aristocratic orders. This was not just war, it was evolution. By the end of the Third War, the Samnites were broken, though never tamed. Rome's power now swept across the spine of Italy, from the Etruscan north to the Greek cities of the south. Capua, Naples, Beneventum fell or submitted, drawn into the growing Roman order. Not all were enemies. Some cities joined willingly, rewarded with alliances that gave status without independence. Rome did not destroy, absorbed, and with every conquest came a pattern. Roads to move troops, colonies to hold land, citizenship, in degrees, to bind people. Rome was not yet an empire, but she was becoming something more than a city. The peninsula, once a patchwork, began to wear the same face. In the dust and blood of these wars, the Republic learned what it meant to command not just in battle, but in structure, patience, and permanence. Italy had become hers, not by chance, but by design. And the world beyond was beginning to notice. Beyond the blue curve of Italy's southern coast lay a richer prize, the island of Sicily, fertile, contested, and dangerously close. It was not Rome's, nor had it ever been, but its position made it inevitable. Between Italy and Africa, between East and West, Sicily was the hinge on which Mediterranean power would turn. And already, another power watched it closely. Carthage was older, richer, and far more experienced. A Phoenician daughter grown powerful and proud. It ruled the western seas with a merchant's grace and a warrior's readiness. Its harbours were full of ships, its vaults full of silver, its gods ancient and strange. Where Rome had risen through land and legions, Carthage ruled through trade, coin, and command of the waves. The two cities had signed treaties before mutual respect, cautious distance, but now they stood too close. It began in Messana, a small port on Sicily's northeast edge, claimed by mercenaries and coveted by both sides. A minor squabble, a local plea for help, but beneath it ran deep currents. When Rome answered the call and crossed the strait, Carthage saw it as trespass. Neither side was ready to back down. What followed was the First Punic War, a clash that would stretch over 2 decades and reshape the Mediterranean world. For Rome, it was a war unlike any before. The enemy was not in the hills of Italy but across the sea, and sea was where Carthage ruled. At first, Rome faltered. She had no navy to speak of, no experience with wind or sail, only the discipline of her legions and the stubbornness of her resolve. But Rome did not accept limits. She studied captured Carthaginian ships, copied their design, and built a fleet from nothing. Hundreds of vessels, constructed not by sailors, but by soldiers who had never set foot on a deck. Still, Rome knew she could not match Carthaginian seamanship, so she turned the sea into land. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into infantry engagements. When enemy ships drew near, the Roman marines stormed aboard like they were storming city walls. It was clumsy, crude and effective. The war dragged on. Battles were won and lost. Fleets sank in storms. Fortunes rose and fell. But slowly, the tide turned. Carthage was bled by the war's length, its mercenaries tired, its wealth strained. Rome, though battered, endured. At last, at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, Rome struck decisively. Carthage sued for peace. Sicily was ceded the Republic's first province beyond the peninsula. The victory was not only one of territory, but of identity. Rome had crossed water, challenged a superpower, and prevailed. But peace would not last. The Punic Wars had begun not just a rivalry, but a reckoning. Carthage was wounded, not dead. And Rome, now a naval power, had tasted something new, the world beyond her shores. The wind bit hard across the peaks, carving ice into stone and numbing the breath of men who should have died long before they reached that height. Below them, broken paths twisted between cliffs and snowfields. Above them, only sky and silence. And moving through it all came Hannibal, commander, oathkeeper, architect of dread, leading an army not homeward, but toward Rome. The Second Punic War began not in Italy, but in Spain, where Carthage had found new ground to rebuild its strength. There, Hamilcar Barca, the firebrand of the First War, had planted a legacy in his son. The boy, Hannibal, had sworn hatred to Rome with his hand on the altar, and when he came of age, he made good on the promise. He struck first at Saguntum, a city Rome had claimed as under its protection. The walls fell, and with them, the fragile peace. But Hannibal did not wait for war to come to him. He brought it to Italy in a way no one expected. The route was madness over the Pyrenees, across the Rhone, and through the Alps, with tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and war elephants. It was a path few would choose, and fewer would survive. The mountains tore at them, the weather turned cruel, and the local tribes harassed every step. Men slipped into ravines, elephants froze. But Hannibal did not turn back. When he emerged in the north of Italy, battered but alive, Rome reeled. Her legions rushed northward, expecting an easy victory against a worn-down invader. But at the river Trebia, in the freezing waters of midwinter, Hannibal's forces lured them in and broke them. Then, at Lake Trasimene, he struck again, trapping thousands in a foggy pass and cutting them down without mercy. Panic began to stir, but it was at Cannae that dread became despair. There, in the summer heat, Hannibal faced the largest army Rome had ever assembled. He drew them in with a soft center and crushed them with a vice of cavalry and veterans closing from both sides. Nearly 50 Romans fell in a single day. The Republic staggered. Her allies wavered. Her faith trembled. Yet she did not fall. Rome refused to negotiate. She raised new armies, elected Fabius Maximus, who counseled delay, shadowing Hannibal without offering battle. Time became Rome's weapon. Cities that had defected were retaken. Allies were won back. And Hannibal, brilliant but isolated, could not break the city's will. For over a decade, he remained in Italy, undefeated but stranded. His elephants are gone. His reinforcements were denied. He became a ghost on the Italian hills, feared but fading. Eventually, the war turned back to Carthage, and Hannibal was summoned home. At Zama, he faced the Roman general Scipio, who had studied his tactics and brought them back across the sea. Hannibal lost, but his legend had already taken root. He had brought Rome to her knees. But Rome had risen, bloodied and unbroken. Her darkest hour became the forge of something greater. The sea shimmered quietly beneath the sun, but on its shores stood a city once called the Jewel of the West. Carthage, proud and ancient, with harbours carved in perfect circles and walls, so thick they laughed at siege. She had weathered storms before wars, loss, hunger, and still she stood, stubborn as stone. But the shadow rising now was no longer rivalry. It was Rome. The Second Punic War had ended in ashes for Carthage. Hannibal, defeated at Zama, had returned not to a hero's welcome, but to suspicion and exile. Scipio, his Roman mirror, earned the name Africanus and the undying admiration of a republic that now felt the pull of something more than safety. It was no longer enough to survive. Rome had tasted supremacy, and she hungered for permanence. For a time, there was quiet. Carthage, bound by treaty, paid her debts and rebuilt in silence. Her trade resumed, her wealth returned. But with each step forward, Roman suspicion deepened. She had lost her armies, but not her memory. Rome had learned that enemies do not always fall with the first blow, they must be ended. The voice that rang loudest was Cato the Elder, sharp and unyielding. He ended every speech with the same phrase, whether speaking of taxes or roads: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, not weakened, not watched, destroyed. The pretext came easily. Carthage, threatened by a neighboring African kingdom, took up arms without Rome's permission. It was a breach, however slight, and the Senate seized it. A new war was declared the Third Punic War, swift in name, but brutal in practice. Carthage tried to appease. She surrendered weapons, hostages, even her defenses. But Rome wanted more. Rome wanted her gone. The final demand was unthinkable. The entire population must leave the city, and Carthage would be razed to the ground. That was the moment when silence became resistance. For 3 years, Carthage fought like a cornered lion. Her people turned homes into fortresses, melted jewelry into weapons, and fought street by street. But it was not enough. The Roman siege closed in. Hunger gnawed. Fire spread. And in 146 BCE, Rome breached the walls. Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption to the first Scipio, led the final assault. As the city burned behind him, he wept. Not from mercy, but from foresight. He quoted Homer Troy too, had fallen and whispered that all empires, even Rome's, must one day burn. But not yet. Carthage was wiped from the map. Her soil was cursed, her walls leveled, her name nearly forbidden. In her place rose a province, not an enemy. Africa was Roman now. With that, Rome crossed a threshold. She had not just won a war, had buried a rival and claimed the world beyond Italy. Her legions no longer fought for defense, but for dominance. The Republic had survived Hannibal, but something deeper had changed. Rome no longer feared destruction. Now, she feared only limits. While the ashes of Carthage still smouldered in the west, Rome turned her eyes toward the rising sun. Eastward lay older empires, lands of marble columns and gilded scrolls, where philosophers had debated gods and man, long before Rome's walls were mud and timber. Greece, Macedon, Asia Minor, these were not new worlds to discover, but old ones to claim, and in claiming them, Rome would be changed. The first steps were cautious. Macedon, once ruled by Alexander the Great, still held sway over much of the Greek world. But the empire he carved had splintered into brittle fragments, held together by kings more concerned with intrigue than greatness. Rome came not as a conqueror, or at least not at first, but as an arbiter, a friend to Greek cities weary of Macedonian dominance. War came anyway, as it always did. Rome's legions clashed with the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of spears that had once conquered the known world. But it was no longer invincible. At Cynocephalae, in the mist-covered hills of Thessaly, Roman flexibility overcame Macedonian rigidity. The phalanx faltered. The old world cracked. The king surrendered. Rome declared Greece free, the cities liberated. But freedom from one master often meant obedience to another. Roman influence deepened. When resistance stirred, again by Perseus, the last king of Macedon Rome returned with fire and iron. At Pydna, the phalanx broke for good. Macedon was no longer a kingdom. It was a province. Greece followed, slowly and unwillingly. The proud cities of the past Corinth, Thebes, Athens each played their part. Each either bowed or burned. In 146 BCE, the same year Carthage fell, Corinth was sacked. Statues shattered, temples looted, its people sold into slavery. Rome's message was clear. Rebellion would not be endured, even from civilizations that had once defined the word itself. Yet as Roman soldiers marched through the ruins, they carried more than spoils. they carried wonder. From Greece came art, philosophy, and language. Roman generals returned home with libraries, tutors, and marble fragments of forgotten gods. Young patricians learned to quote Homer, to walk like Stoics, to speak in accents not their own. Greek slaves became Roman educators. Greek statues adorned Roman villas. The conquerors became the pupils. Rome adopted Greek forms but kept Roman purpose. Temples rose with Corinthian columns, but the rituals were Roman. Orators spoke in Cicero's Latin, but their arguments echoed Plato and Aristotle. A Roman might conquer with sword and senate, but he would quote Socrates while doing so. It was not theft. It was a transformation. Greece had conquered the minds of her conquerors, and Rome, always practical, made what was foreign familiar. In the East, Rome found more than enemies. She found herself in reflection older, wiser, clothed in marble and myth. And though her banners flew now from the Aegean to the Adriatic, she had gained something greater than territory. She had inherited a legacy and made it her own. Rome's victories had brought her gold, land, and glory. Her legions returned from distant shores with wagons full of treasure and chains full of prisoners. Markets swelled with goods from Greece, Africa, and Asia. Foreign spices perfumed Roman kitchens. Silk and silver flowed through the hands of merchants. But beneath the triumphal arches and marble temples, something ancient and fragile began to fracture. The spoils of empire had come home, and with them came imbalance. The heart of the Republic had once been its farmer citizens who tilled their own land, fought in Rome's wars, and returned to plough the same soil. But now, the wars lasted longer. Soldiers marched for years, far from their fields, and returned to find their land sold, neglected, or claimed by creditors. Their homes had withered without them. In their place rose the latifundivast estates owned by the wealthy, worked by slaves. Land that had once belonged to hundreds now answered to one. These great plantations produced grain, wine, and oil in quantities the Republic had never seen. But they also hollowed out the middle, leaving fewer men with land, fewer voices with votes, and more drifting toward the cities, rootless and bitter. Rome itself swelled with this flood of the displaced. The streets grew crowded, tenement blocks rose, stacked high and close, fragile as kindling. The urban poor, once small and quiet, became a mass restless, hungry, and watched. Bread and circuses became more than distraction. They were necessity. Grain was imported to feed them. Games were offered to pacify them. But their anger remained, just beneath the surface, like smoke before fire. At the top, the aristocracy flourished. Old patrician families now added Eastern gold to their ancestral pride. New menobiles joined them through war and wealth, buying power with silver and ambition. The Senate, once a council of farmers and warriors, grew distant, robed in Greek tutors and Greek statues. They debated policy in porticos lined with marble, while in the streets below, clients gathered for handouts. And yet, not all corruption wore a sneer. Some tried to fix the system. The Gracchi brothers, born of noble blood but stirred by conscience, sought to return land to the dispossessed. They proposed reform modest. At first, but even modest change proved too much. Tiberius Gracchus was killed by a mob of senators. Gaius followed, meeting his end on the Aventine. Their deaths marked a turning point. Rome, which once prided itself on civil order, had spilled blood in the Forum. The Republic endured, but something had changed. The victories abroad had made Rome rich but not whole. Wealth flowed in like a river, but it carved deep channels as it went, separating the many from the few. Rome had gained the world, but within her walls, the cost was rising. And the storm, still distant, was gathering force. They were born of privilege, heirs to names spoken with respect in the Senate halls. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, were not outsiders clawing for power, they were insiders with a conscience. Their mother, Cornelia, daughter of Scipio Africanus, raised them on stories of duty, not luxury. She called them her jewels, not for their lineage, but for what they might yet become. In time, they would become something more than noble. They would become a fracture in the Roman soul. Tiberius Gracchus went first. Young, eloquent, and possessed of a quiet certainty, he walked not with fire, but with purpose. What he saw disturbed him. Small farmers, the backbone of the Republic, displaced and desperate, great estates sprawling across former public land, worked by slaves. Rome's armies drawn from men who no longer owned land at all. The system, once sturdy, was breaking beneath its own weight. He proposed a simple remedy: enforce the old laws. No citizen should hold more than a set amount of public land. The rest should be redistributed to the poor, to those who had bled for Rome and come home to nothing. It was not revolution, it was restoration. But power rarely welcomes even gentle correction. The Senate resisted. They saw not fairness, but threat. Land was not just wealth, it was power, legacy, and pride. Tiberius, blocked by custom, bypassed the Senate and took his reforms directly to the people. He was elected tribune, shield of the plebs, and used his position to press forward. When his co-tribune tried to veto the proposal, Tiberius had him removed legal, but unprecedented. Rome had laws, but also invisible boundaries, and Tiberius had crossed one. The reform passed. Land commissions were created, but Tiberius wanted more. A second term as tribune, rare and unsettling. Rumors whispered of kingship, ambition cloaked in virtue. On the day of the vote, violence erupted. Senators, led by the pontifex, Maximus Tiberius's own cousin, armed themselves with clubs, benches, anything they could find. They found Tiberius near the temple of Jupiter and beat him to death. His body was thrown into the Tiber without rites. The Republic had answered reform with murder. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus rose. Sharper, fiercer, more calculating. He expanded his brother's vision grain subsidies for the poor, judicial reform to check senatorial abuse, colonies for the landless. He sought not just to ease suffering, but to rebalance power. The Senate watched with clenched teeth. When his support wavered, they acted. A final decree Senatus Consultum Ultimum gave consuls power to protect the state by any means. Gaius fled to the Aventine Hill. Surrounded, he ordered a slave to end his life before capture. Like his brother, he died not in battle, but in the heart of the city he tried to heal. The Gracchi did not fail. They exposed the cracks. And through those cracks, history would pour. Reform had been met with resistance. Resistance had birthed blood, and the Republic would never be the same. In the years after the Gracchi, Rome no longer spoke in whispers. Politics had learned the taste of blood, and ambition no longer wore a mask. The old Republic, built on law, precedent, and shared power, now bent under the weight of new forces. And rising from the plains of Arpinum, far from the marble and manners of Rome, came a man who would reshape the Republic's most sacred institution, its army. Gaius Marius was no patrician. He had no ancient name, no storied lineage, but he had grit, brilliance, and the quiet fire of someone who understood the rules well enough to break them. He climbed the cursus honorum step by step, each office earned, not inherited. And when Rome faced crisis in the form of foreign threats from the wild north and the restless east, she turned to him. The challenge was clear. The old Roman army, a force of citizen soldiers who owned land and served when called, could no longer meet the needs of an expanding empire. Wars stretched farther, lasted longer. The property requirements excluded too many. The fields of Italy could no longer fill the ranks. Marius changed that. He opened enlistment to the poor, the capitae censi, citizens who owned nothing but their heads. These men were desperate, landless, and hungry for opportunity. Marius gave them armor, weapons, and a cause. In return, they gave him loyalty. The Marian army was no longer a seasonal force. It became professional, trained, disciplined, and dependent on its general, not just for orders, but for food, pay, and promise. Marius promised land upon retirement, a stake in the world they helped conquer. The bond was personal, direct, and dangerously powerful. The results were immediate. Marius defeated Jugurtha in Africa, humbled the Germanic tribes at Aquae Sextiae and Vercelli, and became a hero of the people. He was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times. The old nobility scowled, but the crowds cheered. Yet beneath the triumphs lay something darker. The army had changed. And so had Rome. A soldier's first loyalty was no longer to the Senate or the state, it was to his general. The Republic had handed swords to the landless, and they had learned where to point them. Marius had not intended revolution, but he had rewritten the covenant between Rome and her legions. And then came politics, rivalry, fear, and bitterness. Marius clashed with his former ally Sulla, another ambitious general, but one born of patrician pride. Their feud would spiral into the first full civil war, and the streets of Rome would once again run red. The reforms of Marius saved Rome in his time, but they planted the seed of a future she could not control. The legions were stronger, but now they listened to men, not laws. And in the silence after battle, Rome had to ask, who truly held the Republic, the Senate, or the sword? Lucius Cornelius Sulla was a patrician by birth, but a predator by instinct. Beneath his refined bearing and calculated reserve lay a man shaped by blood and betrayal. His rise came not through charm or popularity, but through precision on the battlefield, in the Senate, and ultimately within the soul of the Republic itself. He had watched the chaos unfold. Marius's armies, urban mobs, power torn from tradition. Sulla did not merely want victory. He wanted restoration on his terms, at any cost. It began with a war in the east. The kingdom of Pontus, under King Mithridates, had swept through Asia Minor and into Greece, slaughtering Roman citizens by the tens of thousands. The Senate entrusted Sulla, a decorated general, with command. But back in Rome, the political winds shifted. Marius, long retired but never quiet, conspired with the populares to strip Sulla of his command and seize it for himself. It was an outrage, a personal insult, and a constitutional violation. Sulla's response stunned the Republic. He turned his legions around and marched on Rome itself. No Roman general had ever done it. The city was sacred, but Sulla was finished with sacred. His soldiers entered Rome not as defenders but as conquerors. Swords flashed in the forum, blood mixed with law. For the first time, Rome fell to her own. Sulla secured his position, then sailed east to crush Mithridates. While he fought abroad, chaos returned. Marius, old and fevered with vengeance, retook the city and unleashed a wave of terror. When Sulla returned, he came not as a general, but as something older and colder, a man who believed that the Republic could be healed only through controlled violence. Appointed dictator legibus faciendis et re publicae constituendi, with no term limit, Sulla redrew Rome's laws, with the same iron he wielded in war. But first came the proscriptions, lists of enemies declared outlaw, their lives forfeit. No trial, no defense. Their names were posted in the forum. Anyone could kill them. Many did. Heads were nailed to the rostra. Property was seized. Sons of the condemned were barred from office. Revenge wore the mask of reform. Then came the reforms. The Senate, swollen with his supporters, was restored as the center of power. Tribunes were muzzled, their authority clipped to prevent further populist upheaval. The cursus honorum was rigidly enforced. Magistrates limited. The system, Sulla believed, had bent because it lacked structure. He gave it iron scaffolding, and then, in one final gesture of control, he walked away, resigned the dictatorship, retired to his villa in Campania, died quietly, his reforms intact, the Republic seemingly repaired. But Rome had learned something it could not forget. That power could come from the sword, that a general could march on the city and write the laws in blood. Sulla believed he was saving the Republic. In truth, he had shown it how to die with a list, a legion, and a name etched in fear. He was not born to shake empires. Spartacus came from Thrace, a soldier once, then captured, enslaved, and thrown into the blood-stained sand of a Roman gladiator school. In that world, freedom was a whisper buried beneath chain and whip, drowned in cheers for death. But Spartacus listened. And when the time came, he answered. The revolt began not with legions, but with knives carved from kitchen tools. 70 gladiators broke from Capua's ludus, cutting through their guards and seizing what weapons they could. They fled to Vesuvius not to disappear, but to rise. There, in the wild slopes of the volcano, they were no longer performers of violence. They were men again. And others came slaves from the fields, the mines, the kitchens, joining not for ideology, but for breath, for vengeance, for hope. Rome laughed at first. A few runaway slaves, a minor nuisance. Forces were dispatched, small and careless. Spartacus crushed them. He was no warlord, but he remembered the tactics of his past life, and now he used them with furious purpose. Discipline emerged. Raids became campaigns. What began as escape became war. Within months, the revolt swelled to tens of thousands. A ghost army, impossible, yet real, roamed southern Italy. Towns fell. Villas burned. Legions stumbled and bled. Spartacus dreamed of more than survival. Some say he planned to march north, cross the Alps, and scatter his people to freedom beyond Rome's grasp. Others believed he wanted to turn and strike at the capital itself. What Spartacus truly intended is lost to time. What he achieved remains carved in memory. The Senate, humiliated and afraid, turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, now desperate for glory. He brought discipline back to the Roman side, reviving ancient punishments, crucifying his own soldiers to restore order. Crassus hunted Spartacus with cold efficiency, pinning him in the south, building fortifications to trap him. Still, Spartacus broke through, but the dream was fading. Rome had awakened. Pompey returned from Spain in triumph, his legions fresh and ready. Between Crassus and Pompey, the rebellion was cornered. The final battle came in brutal Claritino, tricks, no escapes. Spartacus fought to the death, at the center of the storm, his body never found, only legend left behind. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Aegean way. A forest of agony stretching from Capua to Romea, warning hung on wooden crosses. The Republic had survived, but not unshaken. The revolt did not topple Rome, but it pierced the illusion of order. It reminded the masters that the enslaved were many, and that beneath the weight of chains, fire still smoldered. Spartacus had no senate, no temple, no crown. Yet for a moment, the world's greatest power feared a man who refused to kneel. Rome, in the aftermath of blood, turned to two men, one born into unimaginable wealth, the other into ruthless ambition. Crassus and Pompey opposites in almost every way, yet bound by the vacuum left behind by Sulla, Spartacus, and the shivering memory of civil war. They were not saviors. They were survivors, architects of a fragile peace, built not on trust, but on competition. Crassus had everything that money could buy. His fortune came from fire and ash buying the properties of the condemned during Sulla's proscriptions, running slave labor camps and controlling Rome's firefighting crews. His wealth was endless, but respect had always eluded him. He sought glory not in coin but in command. His suppression of Spartacus gave him some, but the taste only sharpened his hunger. Pompey was the golden son of war, young, noble, undefeated. He had marched under Sulla, crushed rebellion in Sicily and Spain, and returned to Italy at the head of legions loyal not to the Senate, but to him. He was hailed as Magnus the Great before he had even held formal office. His victories were gifts Rome could not ignore, even as the Senate looked on with dread. The two men returned to a republic in disarray. The consulship of 70 BCE was meant to restore order, to steady the ship of state. Pompey and Crassus were elected together, not because they agreed, but because the people demanded it and the Senate feared what would happen if they didn't. It was a forced partnership, cold and suspicious, but necessary. Rome needed stability. These men offered it. Their consulship brought reforms, rolled back some of Sulla's harshest measures, and restored the tribune's powers. Crassus championed the people to gain popularity. Pompey courted the Senate to appear the traditionalist. They circled one another like wary wolves, each aware that the other held the knife behind his back. For a time, it worked. Pompey's next chapter lay in the east. Given sweeping powers through the Lex Gabinia, he crushed piracy in a matter of months, then dismantled the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, reorganized Asia Minor, and turned Syria into a Roman province. His conquests were swift, his settlements lasting. He returned to Rome with prestige unmatched, parading through the streets with kings in chains and gold heaped before him. Crassus, watching from the shadows, seethed, but he was too shrewd to strike. Instead, he waited, plotted, and watched as another young man, brilliant, daring, hungry, entered the arena, Julius Caesar. For now, the uneasy peace held. The Republic balanced on the shoulders of two men who despised each other, yet needed each other. Their rivalry did not end the Republic, but it cracked its foundation, showed how fragile shared power could be, and how easily ambition could shift from cooperation to conquest. The storm had not yet come, but the sky was darkening. He was born into old blood and fading fortune, a scion of the Julia patrician family, with divine claims and political irrelevance. Gaius Julius Caesar entered a world in crisis, where tradition buckled under ambition and names meant little without armies behind them. But from an early age, Caesar showed he would not be buried in history. He would write it. Rome was not kind to the unproven. After the turmoil of Sulla's dictatorship, Caesar found himself marked by blood and allegiance. His uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius. The hero turned exile, and that name alone placed Caesar under suspicion. When Sulla came to power, he ordered Caesar to divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of a Marian loyalist. Caesar refused. It was a decision not of romance, but of principle, and it nearly cost him his life. He fled Rome, hunted and stripped of inheritance. Yet even in exile, Caesar displayed the poise and cunning that would define him. He pleaded with Sulla's allies, bided his time, and eventually received a reluctant pardon. Sulla, it said, warned, there are many Mariuses in Caesar. He had glimpsed the future and feared it. Caesar served as a military tribune in Asia, showing early brilliance in command. On his return, he turned toward politics, building a reputation not on brute force, but on charm, eloquence, and calculation. He spent lavishly, often recklessly, using borrowed money to win favor with Rome's lower classes. He spoke in the forum with fire, prosecuted corrupt officials, and flattered the mob with dazzling games and promises of reform. Then came the pirates. Captured while sailing the Aegean, Caesar was held for ransom. The captors underestimated him. He joked with them, promised he would return and crucify them. After his release, he did exactly that. It was not just vengeance, it was a message. Julius Caesar was not a man to be mocked. As he climbed Rome's political ladder, Caesar navigated with unmatched skill. He won the office of Pontifex Maximus through bribery and daring, securing the city's highest religious post while still young and heavily in debt. But every move was part of a larger design. He allied with Crassus for money, with Pompey for influence. The three men, each powerful in their own sphere, formed a private pact, a shadow government later called the First Triumvirate. In public, Caesar spoke for the people. In private, he calculated for power. He promised land, debt relief, and glory, but behind the smile was steel. His ambition burned cold and quiet, a vision not of survival, but supremacy. By the time he was elected consul in 59 BCE, the Republic no longer feared Caesar, it relied on him. What the Senate could not see was that the boy they had dismissed had become the storm on the horizon, and Rome would never be the same again. It was not declared with fanfare or etched into law. The first triumvirate began in whisper-sin smoky rooms and private gardens where three men, each too ambitious to serve, too powerful to ignore, reached across their rivalries and joined hands, not in friendship, but in necessity. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, a general, a tycoon, and a politician. Together, they would bend the Republic to their will. The Senate had no place for them, at least not as equals. Pompey, fresh from his victories in the East, returned to Rome, expecting recognition for his veterans, ratification of his eastern settlements, the honors owed to a Roman conqueror. But the Senate, fearful of his popularity and his unmatched military power, denied him. They offered resistance instead of gratitude. Pompey, the golden general, found himself blocked by bitter old men in togas. Crassus, wealthier than any man in Rome, sought prestige to match his fortune. He wanted relief for the tax collectors Publicanio, was strangled by unprofitable contracts in Asia, and who, in turn, owed him. But his proposals were dismissed. His gold could buy influence, but not dignity, not yet. And Caesar, elected consul for 59 BCE, stood on the cusp of greatness, but lacked the institutional weight to push through his agenda. He needed allosones with power in the street and in the treasury. In Crassus and Pompey, he saw more than rivals. He saw opportunity, and so the deal was struck. Pompey would gain land for his soldiers and Senate approval for his settlements. Crassus would get financial reforms that served both his interests and those of the equestrian class. Caesar would secure his laws, his prestige, and, eventually, the proconsular command he craved. None trusted the others. Each knew the alliance was fragile. But for now, it worked. Together, they dominated the state. Caesar pushed legislation through the popular assemblies with force and spectacle, silencing opposition with street violence orchestrated by political gangs. The Senate grumbled, but could do little. The triumvirs controlled too much. The army, the money, the people. The Republic still stood, but its pulse beat to another rhythm. Caesar's consulship ended, but his rise did not. He secured a command in Gaul, a vast stage for military glory and conquest. Pompey married Caesar's daughter, Julia, sealing the alliance in blood and affection. Crassus remained in Rome, wary but tied to the machine he had helped build. This was not ruled by law or tradition. It was ruled by ambition, veiled in the language of the Republic. The first triumvirate was never official, never ratified, and never meant to last. But in its shadow, the old order withered. Rome was no longer led by the Senate, was steered by three men whose private aims masked a slow, relentless unmaking of the Republic. The center was holding, but not for long. It began with restless tribes and spilled Roman blood. The Gallic frontier, vast and fractured, had always loomed as a wild edge to civilization. But to Julius Caesar, it was more than a frontier, it was a stage, a place to carve out destiny with sword and standard. His proconsular command, intended as a reward, became a crucible where a politician forged himself into legend. Gaul was no unified state. It was a patchwork of tribal confederations, ambitious chieftains, rival languages, deep forests, and shifting loyalties. Caesar, with cold brilliance, turned this chaos to his advantage. He exploited rivalries, made allies of some, then crushed them when convenient. He presented his wars as defensive, his massacres as peacekeeping, and Rome believed him, for he wrote the story himself. Commentari de Bello Gallicois dispatches home-turned conquest into prose and slaughter into statesmanship. Year by year, he advanced. The Helvetii were the first to fall, driven back into the Alps. Then the Germans, under Ariovistus, who crossed the Rhine and challenged Rome's claim. Caesar met them in the fields of Alsace and shattered their dreams of expansion. The legions hardened, disciplined, utterly loyal, moved like machines. Bridges were built in days, rivers crossed, forts razed, cities burned, but Gaul did not yield easily. Rebellions simmered beneath forced treaties and Roman garrisons, and then, in 52 BCE, it boiled over. Vercingetorix. His name would echo even through Roman triumph. A nobleman of the Arverni, he united the tribes in a last, desperate uprising. Young, charismatic, ruthless, understood Caesar's methods and countered them with scorched earth, ambushes, and attrition. Towns were abandoned, fields burned. Rome would find no food, no shelter, only resistance. The two giants met in a brutal game of maneuver and siege. At Gergovia, Caesar tasted rare defeat, driven back by Gallic determination and Roman overconfidence. But he learned, adjusted, and waited. When Vercingetorix took refuge in Alesia, hilltop stronghold surrounded by tens of thousands, Caesar encircled him. Then, expecting rescue, the Gallic leader summoned reinforcements. Caesar built a second wall, facing outward, two concentric rings of fortification, trapping the enemy inside and holding off a greater one outside. It was siege warfare on a scale never seen before. The final assault came in a fury of mud, blood, and howling desperation. The Romans, outnumbered and starved, held their lines. When the last Gallic charge broke, the war was over. Vercingetorix, regal even in chains, surrendered in silence, to be paraded years later through Rome before execution. Gaul was conquered. 9 years of war, countless dead, rivers red, and forests razed. But Caesar had what he wanted: glory, wealth, and an army loyal only to him. The Senate watched with awe and fear. The Republic, already trembling, now faced something new, a man who had crossed the Rubicon of ambition long before he would cross it in fact. And Rome would soon feel the weight of a general who no longer needed permission to rule. The river was narrow, barely more than a stream in winter. But when Caesar stepped across the Rubicon in 49 BCE, he did more than ford a border, shattered the Republic's illusion of control. Behind him lay Gaul, conquered and blood-soaked. Before him lay Rome, still clinging to old traditions, unaware they were already ghosts. And with that step, the civil war began. For years, the Senate had watched Caesar with suspicion dressed as gratitude. His victories had filled the treasury. His dispatches had filled the public's imagination. But power that grows too great begins to cast shadows. The alliance with Pompey had withered. Crassus, the third pillar of the triumvirate, had died in the sands of Parthia. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had died in childbirth. Without those bonds, the political marriage decayed. And the Senate, manipulated by Pompey and his allies, demanded Caesar lay down his command and return to Romano as a general, but as a private citizen, vulnerable to prosecution, stripped of immunity. But Caesar was no longer a man who obeyed. He was a man who moved history. The crossing of the Rubicon was an act of rebellion, punishable by death. Roman law forbade any general from bringing armed troops into Italy. To do so was to declare war on the state itself. Caesar knew the weight of the act. As his legions waited, he paused, hesitating only for a moment. Then, according to legend, he uttered the words, "Alea iacta est," die is cast, and marched south. Panic gripped Rome. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now his rival, fled the city with the Senate. They believed they could raise forces in the east, regroup, and crush Caesar with legitimacy and numbers. But they underestimated what he had become. Caesar moved quickly, securing cities, winning over towns, not through bloodshed but by promise. He was not there to destroy Rome, he claimed, but to save it from corruption, from oligarchy, from itself. In a matter of days, the capital was his. The temples still stood, the laws still spoke, but the soul of the Republic had shifted. Caesar addressed the Senate remnants who remained, offering clemency, calling for unity. Yet everyone knew what had begun could not end in peace. Civil war had ignited, not between Rome and a foreign enemy, but between Rome and itself. Two visions of power, two men claiming legitimacy, two armies loyal not to the Republic, but to their commanders. The old institutions consul, senate, tribune became masks for ambition. Behind the ceremonies lurked swords, and loyalty bought with gold and glory. The Republic had endured foreign invasion, famine, and rebellion. But now it faced the most dangerous threat of alla Roman, with nothing left to prove, but everything left to claim. And the river that once marked a boundary now marked the beginning of the end. The Republic had become a battlefield. Rome's streets were quiet, but the thunder of armies echoed across continents. Caesar, the rebel general turned liberator in his own telling, had seized Italy without bloodshed. Pompey, once his ally and now his rival, fled across the Adriatic to gather strength. Senators followed him like exiles, clinging to a fading order, believing that Rome still lived in laws, not legions, but laws no longer ruled. Men did. Pompey had numbers, ships, and the prestige of legitimacy. In Greece, he built an army: senators, nobles, foreign allies, those who feared Caesar's rising sun. They waited, confident, as Caesar pursued with a smaller force, daring the gods and the sea itself. His fleet was harried, his supplies cut, yet still he crossed. And in that moment, the war narrowed to its inevitable conclusion. The two great men, once bound by marriage and alliance, now stood on opposite ends of fate. The battlefield was Pharsalus, a plain in northern Greece, in 48 BCE. Pompey's legions outnumbered Caesar's 2-1. His cavalry, bolstered by eastern kings, promised swift victory. The Senate's confidence brimsome even came with folding chairs, prepared to watch the spectacle of Caesar's ruin. But Caesar had been forged in harder wars. His men were veterans of Gaul, blooded and loyal. He read Pompey's tactics like a scroll. When the great cavalry charge came, Caesar had hidden a fourth line of infantry behind his front. With javelins at the ready, they shattered the horsemen and turned the flank. Pompey faltered. His strategy, so carefully laid, unraveled in hours. His soldiers broke. His command collapsed. Pharsalus was not merely a battlelet, was a dismembering of the Republic's last hope. Pompey fled, abandoning tent, treasury, and pride. Caesar, standing among the dead, ordered mercy for the survivors. He would rather win hearts than destroy them, or so he said. But clemency had its own price. Those spared would never forget who held their fate in hand. Pompey's flight took him to Egypt, a kingdom teetering on its own civil crisis. He sought refuge among old allies. Instead, he was met on the shore by assassins, a dagger to the back, a severed head presented to Caesar, days later meant as a gift, a gesture of allegiance. But Caesar turned away in disgust. The death was not his command, and it robbed him of the final act of triumph. He wept for his rival, or seemed to, then took control of Egypt's court, backing Cleopatra in her struggle for power. Even in mourning, his march to dominance never slowed. From Alexandria to Asia Minor, Africa to Hispania, Caesar stamped out resistance with a speed that seemed preordained. By 45 BCE, the war was over. Caesar returned to Rome not as a consul, but as a master. Triumphs filled the city. Spoils poured into the forum. The Republic still named offices, still held elections, but behind every ritual, one name echoed louder than the rest. The man who had crossed the Rubicon now stood at the summit, and the world below was his. Rome had been conquered not by foreign armies, but by one of her own, and with civil war's dust settling, Julius Caesar turned from battlefield to blueprint. He was no longer the ambitious general clawing for control. He was now the architect of a new Rome, reshaping the Republic not with fire and sword, but with parchment and decree. He knew the damage war had wrought. Cities bled of men, fields abandoned, the Senate broken in all but name. Yet Caesar saw not ruin, but opportunity. The old order had failed. Now came the task of making something new, more stable, more efficient, and, perhaps, more enduring. He began with the calendar. Time itself had grown chaotic under the Republic's mismanagement. Months drifted from seasons, festivals wandered, and the agricultural rhythm faltered. Caesar, advised by Egyptian astronomers, replaced the confusion with clarity. The Julian calendar, anchored in the sun's cycle, restored order to the year, 12 months, a leap day, a structure so sound it would guide centuries. But he did not stop with time. The empire itself needed repair. Veterans, loyal to his cause, had earned their rewards. Caesar settled them in colonies across the Mediterranean, Gaul, Hispania, Africa. It was not just payment, it was policy. Roman blood, Roman language, Roman loyalty dispersed like seeds across conquered lands, binding distant provinces closer to the center. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, had become a withered shell. Caesar expanded it, filling its ranks with provincials, allies, and loyalists. Critics called it dilution, he called it inclusion. Either way, it made clear that Rome was no longer just a city, it was an empire, and its citizens stretched far beyond the old walls. Grain distribution, debt relief, urban planning, every corner of Roman life felt Caesar's touch. He rebuilt temples and forums, drained marshes, improved roadways. He planned to reroute the Tiber, to deepen harbors, to build libraries that would rival Alexandria's. It was vision unbound, the ambition of a man who believed the Republic had to be saved from itself. But with every reform, the old elite watched with growing dread. Power pooled around Caesar's name. Dictator for 10 years became a dictator for life. Statues rose, coins bore his image, and the boundary between leader and monarch grew dangerously thin. To Caesar, it was a necessity. The Republic was broken, and only a singular will could restore order. To others, it was sacrilege. Rome had no kings, Rome had no crowns. Yet for now, Rome had Caesar, a man who had taken time, space, and power into his hands and begun to mold them into something lasting. The wars were over, but the battle for Rome's soul had only changed its form. Peace had come, but under the shadow of one man's authority. A brighter world, perhaps but one increasingly lit by a single sun. He had risen too high. That was the whisper in the Senate halls, the murmured fear behind polished smiles and formal greetings. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of civil war, reformer of state, now stood alone at Rome's pinnacle, dictator for life, his name etched on coins, his statue placed beside the gods. The Republic had not ended in fire, but in silence, in the slow erosion of power, in laws passed with no real debate, in honors bestowed with uneasy hands. To many, Caesar was a savior. He had brought stability after years of chaos, reformed systems broken by neglect, and reminded the provinces they were part of something greater. But to others, he was a king in all but crown. And Rome, they believed, could not abide a king. The conspiracy grew in the shadows, woven from old loyalties, bruised pride, and ancient ideals. Brutus Marcus Junius, Brutus was their symbol. Adopted son of Caesar's enemy, descendant of the Brutus, who had expelled the last Roman monarch centuries before. Beside him stood Cassius, sharp-eyed and bitter, and more than 60 other senators, officers, men who once pledged their lives to Caesar and now prepared to end it. March came, the 15th. The Ides. That morning, omens gathered like clouds. A soothsayer had warned Caesar weeks earlier, beware the Ides of March. His wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of blood. The priests found ill signs in the sacrifices. Even Caesar hesitated, but he dismissed it all. What man, after reshaping the world, could fear shadows? He walked to the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate met while the Curia was rebuilt. The hall was wide, the light slanting through the marble. The conspirators waited. They greeted him with smiles. then surrounded him. It began with a petition, a distraction. Then the first blade flashed. He stumbled, stunned more than wounded. Then came another, and another. He cried out not in pain, but in betrayal as he saw Brutus among them. Et tu, Brute? The words, perhaps apocryphal, echoed louder than any scream. He fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, a cruel irony. The man he had defeated in war now bore witness to his murder in peace. Blood ran across the floor of the Senate chamber. The conspirators, blades slick and hands trembling, believed they had saved the Republic. They believed Rome would rise, purified by the act. Instead, they had torn away the one figure binding the chaos together. The city froze, then cracked. The people mourned or raged. Mark Antony, once Caesar's ally, now carried his bloodied cloak through the forum, inflaming the crowd with funeral oration. The body burned. The dream of peaceful transition with it. The Republic was not reborn. It was buried. The knife that killed Caesar did not restore liberty. It opened the floodgates. Power would not flow back to the Senate. It would be seized by the next man bold enough to claim it, and Rome would never be the same again. The ashes of Caesar's funeral pyre had barely cooled when the next struggle for Rome began. Power, once held by one man, had fractured into ambition, vengeance, and the hunger of those left in his wake. At the heart of it stood a young man, barely 19, pale, deliberate, and utterly determined, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son. Named in the dictator's will as heir, he was not a soldier, not yet a statesman, but the blood of Caesar pulsed in his veins, and that name Octavian would soon command the Republic. Rome was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The Senate hoped to reassert control, while Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, held the reins of military power. He had spoken over the fallen dictator's body, inflaming the mob, and now occupied the consul's chair with force behind him. But Octavian was patient. He did not meet fire with fire. He gathered Caesar's veterans with promises, courted senators with politeness, and appealed to the people with a name that echoed in mourning hearts. He was young, yes, but not naive. He understood what the moment demanded. Conflict with Antony was inevitable. What began as cold maneuvering turned into open hostility, but then came a truce and no peace, but calculation. In 43 BC, on a quiet islet near Bononia, the three most powerful men in Rome, Octavian, Antony, and the forgotten third, Lepidus, met and struck a terrible bargain. They called it the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship with powers to remake the Republic by decree. What followed was blood. The prescriptions returned. Names were written, lives forfeit. Senators and equestrians, allies and enemies, were slaughtered for stability. Cicero, the Republic's last great orator, fell silent by Antony's orders. Lands were seized, fortunes redistributed. It was not justice, but the price of power. With Rome pacified, the triumvirs turned east. The assassins Brutus and Cassius raised armies in Macedonia. At Philippi, in 42 BC, the final battle for Caesar's legacy was fought. Octavian faltered, sick and nearly broken, but Antony held the line. When the dust cleared, Brutus fell on his sword. The liberators were gone. The Republic, for all intents, was dead. Victory bred tension. Lepidus faded quickly, sidelined and stripped of real power. Antony, meanwhile, turned toward the east stand, toward Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian returned to Rome, gathering influence not through passion, but through precision. He courted tradition, played the pious Roman, and cast himself not as a tyrant, but as a restorer of order. All the while, he prepared. The Second Triumvirate had achieved what it promised: vengeance, consolidation, and a semblance of control, but it was not built to last. Two men remained, each the heir to Caesar's ambition. The Republic was gone. In its place stood a contest between Antony's fiery charisma and Octavian's quiet resolve. Rome waited, uneasy and watchful, as the tides of power shifted once more. The boy who had once seemed too young now stood at the edge of the empire, and he would not blink. By the time the winds turned toward Actium, there were only two masters left in the Roman world. One was Fire Marcus Antonius, warrior, lover, and heir by sword. The other was Aeschylus Octavian, methodical, calculating, the quiet shadow who had outlived louder men. For years, their rivalry simmered beneath oaths and gestures, a fragile peace carved into lines across the empire. But peace, in Rome's age, was often the silence before a storm. Antony had chosen the East, not merely as territory, but as identity. His bond with Cleopatra of Egypt had deepened from alliance to entanglement. Together they ruled lands rich with grain, gold, and ancient majesty. Cleopatra was no common queen. She was a Ptolemy, fluent in a dozen tongues, a goddess in her people's eyes. To Antony, she was the futura partner in kingship, in power, perhaps even in empire. But to Rome, especially under Octavian's careful manipulation, she was something else entirely, a foreign enchantress, a threat to Roman values, a symbol of betrayal. In Rome, Octavian wove his campaign not merely in legions, but in stories. He read Antony's will, aloud declaring that Antony intended to be buried in Egypt, that he had gifted Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children. Whether truth or fabrication, it was enough. The Senate declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, a foreign queen. It was a masterstroke of optics. Antony was no longer a Roman contender. He was a traitor, enthralled by the East. The fleets assembled. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, met off the coast of western Greece in 31 BC, near a narrow promontory called Actium. Antony's forces were formidable, but disjointed. His fleet was heavier, his land army larger. Yet Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, struck early, cutting off supply lines, forcing Antony's ships into a desperate gamble. Trapped, weakened by desertion, and plagued by conflicting commands, Antony made a choice. The battle erupted under choking wind and flame. Cleopatra's ships stood at the rear. As the clash intensified, she turned and sailed from the chaos. Whether it was a signal or a flight, Antony followed. His fleet collapsed without its commander. It was not a battle so much as a crumbling. Resistance died in silence, confusion, and smoke. In Alexandria, months later, as Octavian approached, the final curtain fell. Antony, defeated, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, regal to the last, chose the asp, or poisoner one can say. But she died as a queen, not as a captive. Octavian entered the city without resistance. Egypt was his. So too was everything else. The Battle of Actium was more than a military victory, it was the funeral of the Republic's final opposition. No Senate could challenge Octavian now. No general stood in his path. Rome had endured centuries of war, conquest, and ambition. But with Actium, the wars of the Republic ended. The empire had begun, and only one man would wear the crownless crown. When Octavian returned to Rome, it was not as a conqueror, though he had conquered. He did not ride in crimson, demanding titles, though none could refuse him. Instead, he offered peace a word, worn thin by generations of civil war. The Senate, weary and cornered, granted him powers extraordinary in scope, but wrapped in republican language. He was princeps, the first citizen, not king. He held imperium over the provinces and command of the armies. He was tribune, consul, and censor when needed. But most of all, he was Augustus, the revered one, a new name for a new order. It was a subtle revolution. The Republic's corpse still stood, its institutions hollowed but present. The Senate met, magistrates were elected, laws passed. But the machinery of power now flowed through one man. Rome had seen dictators, strongmen, even kings in its distant past. But never before had one individual worn so many faces at once. A god's adopted son, a general without equal, a politician cloaked in restraint. Augustus built an empire on the ruins of freedom, not by shattering the old, but by preserving its facade. The Pax Romanathae, Roman peace, began not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. Decades of internal strife had left scars on every class. Now, under Augustus, roads stretched outward, cities flourished, trade thrived. The legions, once tools of civil war, secured frontiers from Spain to Syria. Veterans were settled in colonies, lands were surveyed, and taxes regularized. He reformed the coinage, standardized administration, and established a civil service loyal not to the Senate, but to him. The empire was now a machine, humming with quiet efficiency. Temples were restored, ancient rites revived. Augustus knew that legitimacy did not rest solely on power, but on the illusion of continuity. He claimed to restore the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, while quietly remaking them. Morality laws punished adultery and rewarded fertility. The family became a pillar of the state, as did religion. And at the center stood Augustus, not as a tyrant, but as Rome's guardian. In art and literature, a golden age dawned. Poets like Virgil and Horace sang of Rome's destiny, echoing Augustus's vision. The Aeneid cast him as the fulfillment of prophecy, the heir not just to Caesar, but to Troy itself. Statues portrayed him as eternally youthful, serene, almost divine. In every forum and province, his image watched. Yet for all the peace and prosperity, there remained an edge beneath the marble. Augustus had learned from Caesar's fate. He held power delicately but firmly, never relaxing his grip. Dissent was quieted, rivals removed. The Senate's applause echoed in halls where its authority had vanished. When he finally died in 14 AD, after over 40 years of rule, the transition was smooth. Power passed not to the people, but to a chosen heir. The Republic, long dead in spirit, was now formally buried. Rome had an emperor not in name, but in every way that mattered, and the world would never be the same. Rome, having settled into the long hush of the Pax Romana, turned its restless energy inward, no longer chasing the thunder of battle, but laying the foundations of permanence. The sword was not forgotten, but now it protected rather than pursued. Across provinces and frontiers, a different kind of conquest unfolded of stone, water, and law. Rome became not just a city, but a world, bound together by roads that carved through mountains and spanned rivers, veins of empire over which merchants, messengers, and legions flowed. The Roman road was more than a path, it was a statement. Straight, unyielding, paved with volcanic stone, these roads linked the farthest reaches of the empire to the heart of the Forum. Milestones counted the distance to Rome, each one a quiet reminder that all places, however distant, were measured in relation to the city. The Via Appia, the queen of roads, stretched to Brundisium, carrying grain, armies, and senators alike. These roads gave Rome its reach, its speed, and ultimately its sense of unity. Water, too, was mastered. Where nature once dictated settlement, Rome bent nature to its will. Aqueducts marched across hills and valleys, silent armies of arches that delivered life to the metropolis. From distant springs, fresh water poured into fountains, public baths, and households of the elite. No city in history had controlled water so completely. Baths became not only places of hygiene, but centers of social life, where politics, business, and leisure met beneath vaulted ceilings and mosaic floors. The aqueduct was more than engineering, it was civilization in stone. Temples rose beside basilicas and markets, sacred spaces in marble that housed the divine and reinforced imperial order. Jupiter, Mars, Venusiach god, had a home in the city, a ritual, a place in the calendar. Religion infused daily life, from offerings at roadside shrines to the grand processions that honored Rome's patron deities. But the temples also served another master. The emperor, often portrayed in divine company, now occupied a place between gods and mortals. In cities across the empire, Statues of Augustus and his successors stood beside traditional gods, blurring the line between worship and loyalty. In this age, Rome itself transformed. The Forum grew crowded with triumphal arches, commemorating victories far beyond Italy's shores. Theatres hosted Greek dramas. Amphitheatres echoed with the roars of gladiators and crowds alike. Grain flowed from Africa, marble from the Aegean, silk from the East. Latin and Greek shared space in every street. The empire, vast and diverse, was woven together by shared laws, common currency, and Roman ambition. Peace, in the Roman sense, was never passive. It was built, brick by brick, on the memory of conquest and the promise of order. And as cities rose, roads stretched, and aqueducts flowed, the people of the empire lived under a sky touched by Roman hands. A world remade in the image of one city disciplined, enduring, and unwilling to be forgotten. The peace that Augustus had forged did not perish with him. It lingered, held in place by the machinery he had built and the reverence he still commanded. Into this carefully constructed system stepped Tiberius's stepson, his heir not by blood, but by design. Taciturn, withdrawn, a soldier at heart, Tiberius ruled not with grandeur, but with suspicion. He preserved the empire's shape, but the spirit began to fray. Where Augustus had charmed, Tiberius brooded. The Senate still convened, the game still played, but a shadow crept into the corridors of power. As age overtook him, Tiberius left Rome for Capri, withdrawing into a palace perched above the sea, where rumors bloomed darker than any edict. In his absence, power drifted into the hands of Sejanus, the praetorian prefect, who used whispers and purges to climb ever higher. His fall came as suddenly as his rise, crushed beneath the emperor's belated wrath. When Tiberius finally died, Rome exhaled but only briefly. His successor was Caligula, the golden boy turned god. Born into the imperial house, raised among soldiers, he ascended with promise and applause. But his reign descended swiftly into spectacle. Whether madness or method, Caligula's rule defied expectation. He drained the treasury on games and gilded projects, declared himself a living deity, and humiliated senators with cruel amusement. He made his horse a priest, perhaps a consul, depending on the source. Behind the laughter was fear. Behind the temples was decay. His assassination, carried out by his own guards, was met with no mourning-only relief. Claudius, uncle to Caligula, was found hiding behind a curtain when hailed as emperor. Limping, stammering, long overlooked, he proved unexpectedly competent. He reasserted imperial dignity, reorganized the bureaucracy, and expanded Rome's borders into Britannia conquest, etched into imperial memory. He relied heavily on freedmen administrators and wives of ambition. His last, Agrippina, secured the succession for her son. Nero's early reign, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the general Burrus, offered hope. He cut taxes, promoted the arts, and spoke of liberty. But power, once unmoored, drifts toward indulgence. Nero fancied himself more artist than emperor. He performed poetry to captive audiences, raced chariots, and filled the city with festivals. The empire's grandeur became a stage for personal fantasy. Rome burned under his watch, whether by accident or design, and from its ashes rose the Domus Aurea, a golden palace that seemed to crown his excess. When he blamed the fire on the Christians, their persecution began. Political rivals and family members fell one by one. His mother, Agrippina, was stabbed after surviving poison and shipwreck. His wife was kicked to death. By the time the provinces revolted and the legions declared for another, Nero, abandoned by all, fled into the darkness and opened his own veins. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, born of Caesar and Augustus, ended not with glory, but with spectacle and blood. What remained was the empire battered, but intact, waiting for a steadier hand. The death of Nero in 68 CE did not bring stability. It unsealed a power vacuum so vast that the empire, for the first time in living memory, lost its voice and center. Rome no longer knew who ruled. From the Palatine to the frontiers, uncertainty spread like smoke. In the space of a single violent year, 4 men would claim the purple. Each would wear it briefly. Only one would endure. Galba came first, summoned from Spain by the Senate's blessing and the Praetorian Guard's greed. Austere, ancient, and severe, Galba imagined himself a restorer of old virtue. But Rome no longer wanted virtue. The soldiers who had raised him expected reward. Instead, he gave them discipline. His brief, joyless reign ended in a street execution, his head paraded on a pike, lips twisted into a final, frozen sneer. Otho followed, smooth and shrewd, a courtier who once dyed his hair and had been a friend of Nero. He won the favor of the guard through bribes and promises, but his prize was contested. In the provinces, another governor had already made his move. Vitellius, commander of the Rhine legions, was marching on Italy with an army forged in Germany's cold discipline and hardened by years along the frontier. The clash came at Bedriacum. Otho, unwilling to prolong the civil war, took his own life with quiet dignity, earning in death the respect he had never won in life. Vitellius, the third emperor, entered Rome in triumph, but proved more gourmand than governor. Lavish banquets, senseless executions, and idle rule soured his welcome. His power-based the northern legions was firm but narrow. In the east, a new contender emerged. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, general of legions besieging Jerusalem, called back by destiny and ambition. He did not rush. While his troops moved westward, he secured alliances and waited for his moment. As Vespasian's forces advanced, Rome unraveled. The streets filled with violence, senators wavered, and the Praetorians, once again, sold their loyalties. Vitellius tried to abdicate, then recanted, dragged from hiding by soldiers who laughed as they killed him. His body was thrown into the Tiber, another emperor, discarded by a city exhausted with chaos. When Vespasian entered Rome in late 69 CE, it was not with pageantry, but with precision. A soldier, not a patrician, he founded a new dynasty born, not from divine lineage, but merit and survival. The Flavian line began not in myth or marble, but in blood, discipline, and the quiet promise of order. The year of the 4 emperors left scars across the empire-burned cities, shattered trust, and an uneasy awareness that Rome's strength no longer came from tradition, but from whoever commanded the legions. The Republic was long dead. Now, even the illusion of stability had to be won with steel. Vespasian came not with noble lineage, but with calloused hands and a general's pragmatism. He was a man of the Provincessan equestrian who had risen through grit, not grandeur. When he entered Rome in 69 CE, the city was still bleeding from the chaos of civil war. The treasury was empty. The streets echoed with fear. The empire had teetered on collapse. Vespasian's first act was not celebration, but stabilization. He restored discipline to the legions and silence to the streets. Where others had ruled with ceremony, he governed with accounts. He reformed the tax system, not to curry favor, but to refill coffers that war had drained. Provinces paid more now, but they paid into a system that functioned. Corruption was punished. Provincial governors were held to account. Roads were repaired. Courts heard cases again. Rome remembered the rhythm of order. In this climate of repair, the most enduring monument of the Flavian dynasty began to rise from the ruins of Nero's extravagance. Where the Domus Aurea, Nero's vast golden house, had once sprawled across the heart of Rome, Vespasian gave the people something else entirely, an amphitheater. Built from concrete and stone, funded by the spoils of the Jewish war, the Colosseum symbolized the return of the city to the people. Gladiators clashed where an emperor had once lounged in gilded halls. It was bread and spectacle, but it was also something deeper, a gesture that Rome belonged not to emperors, but to Romans. Vespasian's rule was not marked by conquest, but by consolidation. He ended the lingering wars in Judea, leaving the brutal final victory to his son, Titus, whose siege of Jerusalem brought both glory and a deep, unspoken scar. The Flavian triumph, paraded through Rome, displayed the looted treasures of the temple and the captured people of a broken city. It was a victory, but it was also a warning. When Vespasian died peacefully in 79 CE, the empire passed smoothly to Titus, who had already acted as co-ruler in practice. It was the first truly peaceful succession since Augustus. Titus, handsome and well-liked, ruled briefly but left a lasting impression. During his short reign, disaster struck. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash, and a great fire swept through Rome. The emperor's calm response to the crisis, his generosity to victims, and his commitment to relief efforts earned him lasting affection. He died after only 2 years on the throne, mourned by the people, a rare fate for an emperor. Domitian, Titus's younger brother, followed. Less beloved, more severe, he ruled for 15 years with autocratic confidence. He expanded the frontier, strengthened the currency, and rebuilt the empire's bureaucracy. Yet his suspicion and cruelty bred fear, not loyalty. When he was finally assassinated, the Senate condemned his memory, erasing his name from monuments. The Flavians, rising from obscurity, had restored the empire, not with grandeur, but with structure. They repaired what others had broken, gave the people what Nero had denied, and proved that power could be born of stability, not spectacle. When Trajan took the purple in 98 CE, he was already a soldier's emperor, broad-shouldered, blunt-spoken, and seasoned on the frontiers. He had no imperial blood, no gilded childhood. Instead, he carried the quiet confidence of a man who had earned command through merit. From the cold camps along the Rhine to the Senate halls of Rome, he brought discipline, clarity, and something Rome had not seen in a generation. Ambition without indulgence. His first priority was not conquest, but cohesion. He walked among the people. He consulted the Senate. He gave Rome back its dignity. Taxes were adjusted, grain supplies stabilized, and infrastructure improved. Roads, aqueducts, and public buildings rose across the empire, not only in Rome, but in distant provinces that had long been neglected. For Trajan, the empire was not a city with subjects, it was a network of citizens. And yet, for all this internal strength, he would become most famous for expansion. In the forests and mountains of Dacia, modern-day Romania, Trajan faced one of Rome's most defiant foes. The Dacians, led by the fierce king Decebalus, had long resisted Roman encroachment. Twice Trajan marched across the Danube, building immense bridges to span its rushing current. The campaigns were brutal and protracted, fought through snow and stone, but in the end, Dacia fell. Decebalus took his own life rather than parade in chains. The spoils flowed into Rome: gold, silver, and slaves. With them, Trajan funded his greatest monument. The Forum of Trajan, crowned by a towering column carved in spiral relief, depicted the Dacian wars in vivid scenes. It told a story of discipline, endurance, and ultimate victory. The people saw not just statues, but memory made permanent in marble. Rome had conquered again, and not just conquered it, had absorbed. Dacia was annexed, settled by veterans, and woven into the imperial fabric. But Trajan's ambitions did not end in Europe. In the east, the Parthian Empire, long-standing rival, beckoned. When internal strife fractured their rule, Trajan saw an opportunity. He marched deep into Mesopotamia, capturing cities whose names echoed with ancient prestige: Babylon, Seleucia, and Ctesiphon. For the first time, Roman standards flew along the shores of the Persian Gulf. It was Rome at its furthest reach. Yet even as his armies pressed eastward, Trajan sensed the limits of the empire. The victories were real, but fragile. Resistance flickered in the cities behind him. Distance strained his supply lines. And time, always silent, always advancing, caught up. Ill and weary, he began the journey back west. He would never see Rome again. Trajan died in 117 CE, not in battle, but in quiet retreat. Yet he left behind a realm larger than it had ever been. The Senate, for once without irony, declared him Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. And every emperor who followed would be greeted with a wish: may you be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. It was not praise, it was a challenge. For in Trajan's reign, Rome had touched the edge of the world. Hadrian inherited an empire stretched to its breaking point. The conquests of Trajan had drawn Rome deep into unfamiliar lands, farther than legions could be sustained, farther than cultures could be absorbed. Hadrian did not see glory in further advance. He saw fragility. And so, when the crown passed to him in 117 CE, the soldier emperor turned his gaze not outward, but inward. Rome, he believed, must be fortified, not expanded. His first acts were decisive. He abandoned Trajan's newly acquired eastern provinces, including Mesopotamia. These were not defeats, but corrections lines drawn with the clarity of reason. He returned to the natural frontiers of the empire, the Rhine, the Danube, and the deserts of the east. In Britain, where northern tribes remained restless, Hadrian marked the edge of Rome with stone. A wall nearly 80 miles long snaked across the width of the island. It was more than a barrier. It was a statement. Here, the empire ends. Beyond lies another world. Hadrian's wall became a living frontier. Soldiers stationed along its length maintained order and watched for movement beyond the moors. Mile castles, turrets, and gates regulated the flow of people and goods. But the wall was not a symbol of retreat. It was a symbol of permanence. Hadrian believed that Rome could endure not by overextension, but by careful stewardship. He did not rule from a marble throne. He traveled. From Africa's deserts to Gaul's forests, from the Aegean's coasts to the valleys of Syria, he walked among the people. Cities welcomed him with statues and celebrations. He responded with endowments, forums, aqueducts. He spoke Greek fluently, quoted philosophers, and surrounded himself with poets and scholars. In Athens, he revived the ancient glories of the city, erecting temples and sponsoring games. To many in the East, Hadrian felt less like a conqueror and more like a native son, but his passions were not only for buildings and books. The emperor's love for Antinous, a Greek youth of striking beauty, became the subject of whispered legend and open devotion. When the boy drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian wept not as a ruler, but as a man undone. He deified Antinous, built temples in his name, and founded a city where he died. The grief became eternal. In busts and coins, the boy's face lived on young, serene, unreachable. Hadrian's reign brought stability, but not serenity. Jewish uprisings in Judea sparked one of the bloodiest suppressions in Roman history. Cities were razed, thousands killed. The ancient province was renamed Syria Palestina in an effort to erase memory itself. Here, too, Hadrian drew a line, but this one with fire and salt. He died in 138 CE, worn and withdrawn. His bones were placed in a mausoleum by the Tiber, a monument to a life spent measuring the empire not in miles gained, but in distances held. Hadrian left Rome bounded but enduring, trimmed of excess, ringed by walls both real and philosophical. He was the builder emperor, the philosopher in armor, the man who taught Rome to endure by standing still. Marcus Aurelius did not seek power, he sought wisdom. Trained from youth in philosophy, guided by the austere teachings of Stoicism, he imagined life not as a stage for glory, but as a test of endurance, discipline, and duty. Yet fate placed the purple robe upon his shoulders, and for 19 years he carried the weight of the Roman world with a quiet, burdened grace. He was an emperor who preferred the stillness of thought to the roar of applause. But the empire he inherited would not allow stillness for long. The northern frontiers burned. Germanic tribes, stirred by famine and pressure from peoples beyond the Danube, surged across the borders in waves. The Marcomannic Wars began, and Rome once again found itself locked in existential struggle. Marcus, no stranger to hardship, took to the field himself. From his campaign tents along the frozen rivers, he issued orders, negotiated with tribal chieftains, and endured the same deprivations as his legions. The philosopher became a warrior not by choice, but by necessity. During these long campaigns, he wrote, in a battered notebook, filled not for others, but for himself, he recorded meditations. Not speeches, not decrees, just reflections and pain, on mortality, on the fleeting nature of fame and power. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be, he wrote. Be one. These words, simple yet unyielding, echoed far beyond the reaches of his war-torn provinces. They have endured longer than the empire he struggled to preserve. His reign, though noble, was a reign of attrition. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox or measles, swept across the empire, claiming millions of lives. Cities emptied, fields went unharvested, entire legions weakened. The empire, long accustomed to abundance and vigor, now tasted fragility. Even Rome itself, the eternal city, trembled. Marcus ruled not alone. His adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, shared the throne for a time, though his contribution was more ceremonial than strategic. Later, Marcus appointed his son Commodus as co-emperor, a decision that would haunt the legacy he so carefully built. But Marcus was tired. War, disease, and years of relentless responsibility had worn even the philosopher king thin. He may have hoped that blood and training could forge another wise ruler. He was wrong. In 180 CE, Marcus died at Vindobona, far from Rome, far from comfort. The empire mourned. The Senate deified him, and his ashes were returned to the city he had served with such quiet devotion. But with his death, something more than a man passed. The golden age of Stoic emperors, of duty-bound philosopher rulers, faded into history. What followed would be louder, more violent, and less restrained. Marcus Aurelius was not a conqueror. He was not a builder of monuments. He was the last great steward of an empire straining under its own weight. And though his body returned to dust, his thoughts remain, whispering through the centuries, offering a guide not just for emperors, but for any soul seeking to remain upright in a world falling apart. When Marcus Aurelius died, the empire passed not into steady hands, but into the clenched fists of a showman. Commodus, his son, had grown in luxury rather than discipline. Where his father had endured war and philosophy, Commodus chose pageantry, spectacle, and indulgence. He did not inherit the stoic soul of Marcus, only the imperial mantliand. He wore it like a costume in the arena. At first, there was hope. The succession, peaceful and orderly, marked a rare moment in Rome's turbulent dynastic history. Commodus, young and healthy, was expected to carry the legacy forward, but quickly the court became a theatre of paranoia. The new emperor withdrew from affairs of state, delegating responsibility to favorites, freedmen, and sycophants. The Senate was reduced to a hushed assembly of frightened men. Corruption seeped through the imperial palace like smoke under a door. Positions were bought. Justice was sold. Fear became currency. And then came the games. Commodus fancied himself not only as emperor but gladiator, not metaphorically. He dressed in armor, wielded a blade, and stepped into the arena. He fought not hardened warriors, but wounded men, captives, or beasts, drugged into stupor. The crowds, fed with free bread and endless violence, cheered. But beneath the applause, Rome recoiled. For the first time, the emperor had descended into the blood and sand of the amphitheatre, not as a god to be worshipped, but as a man to be gawked at. He renamed Rome in his own honor. The legions, the Senate, even the months of the calendar bore his name. Statues rose of Commodus, dressed as Hercules, lion skin over his shoulders, club in hand, grinning in marble with hollow eyes. He imagined himself divine. He demanded adoration. But what he could not command was respect. The empire groaned under his rule. The provinces were left to their own devices. Inflation soared. Military discipline frayed. Assassination plots brewed constantly, fueled by betrayal and revenge. His sister conspired. Senators plotted. Assassins failed. Each attempt fed Commodus's delusion that he was invincible, chosen, untouchable. But no man is untouchable forever. On the last night of 192 CE, after years of misrule and madness, a conspiracy finally succeeded. Poison failed. A wrestler was sent instead. Commodus died, not in glory, not in battle, but strangled in his bath by a servant's hands. His death was met with a strange silence, more relief than mourning. The Senate declared his memory damned, tore down his statues, and erased his name from public inscriptions. The empire, briefly, exhaled, but the damage had been done. Commodus had blurred the line between emperor and entertainer, between leadership and spectacle. In his fall, the old fabric of imperial dignity had been torn, and though emperors would come and go, the crack in the foundation would remain. The philosopher had given way to the gladiator, and Rome would never quite be the same again. The century that followed Commodus cracked the empire open like brittle stone. From the shadows of his death emerged a parade of emperorsum, brave, some brutal, many doomed. In the span of 50 years, more than 20 men would claim the purple. Few would die in bed. Most would fall by the sword. The empire, once ruled from marble halls, became a battlefield of ambition and survival. The year 235 CE marks the beginning of the crisis. Alexander Severus, still a boy in many ways, was murdered by his own troops on the German frontier. He had preached diplomacy when his soldiers craved blood. They replaced him with Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a man from humble origins, more a warlord than a statesman. It set the tone. Rule was now seized with steel, not settled with ceremony. Legions elevated their generals, often at sword point, only to cut them down months later when fortunes shifted. Authority came not from Rome, but from the loyalty of cold, tired soldiers on distant frontiers. As emperors rose and fell like coins tossed in the wind, the empire fractured. Gaul, Spain, and Britain broke away into a Gallic empire. The East would briefly answer to Palmyra, ruled by Queen Zenobia, who styled herself the protector of Roman tradition while marching on Alexandria. From within, unity dissolved. From without, fresh horrors arrived. The frontiers burned. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube, testing weakened Roman defences. In the east, the Sassanid Persians emerged as fierce challengers, eager to avenge ancient humiliations. In 260 CE, Emperor Valerian marched against them. He was captured, not slain, but paraded in chains, humiliated, and used as a human footstool by King Shapur. His death, years later, was as ignoble as his captivity. Rome, watching from afar, shuddered, and then came plague. Likely smallpox or measles, it swept through cities and camps with no regard for rank. Crops failed, trade slowed, temples stood empty. Entire legions vanished, not from battle, but from illness. The population shrank, coinage was debased. The economy staggered under the weight of endless war and waning trust. Yet somehow, the empire endured. Like a battered ship in stormy seas, it cracked and splintered, but did not sink. The strength of its roads, its cities, and its stubborn identity as Rome kept it afloat. In the chaos, certain emperors did rise to the moment Aurelian would reclaim lost provinces and rebuild shattered walls, but the century remained scarred. By 284 CE, when Diocletian finally seized power, With a vision of reform, the Roman world had changed beyond recognition. It was no longer the marble colossus of Augustus's making, but a bruised, battered veteran of constant crisis. And yet, the dream of empire remained. Tattered, yes. Bloodied, certainly. But still alive. Still Rome. In the shadowed alleys of Rome, in the catacombs beneath her bustling streets, and in the whispered gatherings of the poor, a new faith took root. It did not begin with conquest, but with conviction. It spread not by legions, but by lives willingly laid down. Christianity was born in the provinces, among fishermen and tax collectors, artisans and slaves, and from the margins of the empire, it would rise to claim the heart of Roman power. The story began in a distant corner of the empire, Judea, a volatile province watched warily by governors and garrisons. There, under Tiberius, a Galilean preacher walked dusty roads, speaking of love, mercy, and a kingdom not of this world. His name was Jesus. His message challenged the proud and lifted the broken. He healed the sick, ate with outcasts, and spoke as if with divine authority. To the Roman eye, he was another street prophet in a land thick with them. But his execution, brutal and public, by crucifixion, was not the end. For his followers, it was the beginning. They claimed he had risen. And from that claim sprang a movement that defied fear, reason, and imperial decree. Apostles like Peter and Paul carried the message through ports, cities, and across continents. They preached in synagogues, argued in forums, and spoke in marketplaces. They were jailed, beaten, exiled, and killed. Yet their message endured, that all people, regardless of birth or station, were loved by God. That suffering could have purpose, that death was not the end. Rome did not know what to make of them. At first, they were seen as a sect of Judaism, a minor irritation. But as the lines grew clearened, as Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor or participate in pagan rites, they drew suspicion. To Roman sensibilities, their exclusivity was offensive, even dangerous. Worship of the gods was not mere superstition, it was a civic duty. Refusing it was seen not as piety, but as treason. Persecutions followed. Under Nero, Christians were blamed for the great fire of Rome. He fed them to beasts, lit his gardens with their burning bodies, and made them scapegoats for his sins. Others followed Decius, Valerian, Diocletian. Waves of arrests, tortures, and executions swept through the cities. But the blood of martyrs did not silence the faith, it fed it. Stories of courage spread faster than edicts. Underground networks grew. Bishops emerged as community leaders, guiding flocks in secrecy, often at the cost of their lives. Through it all, the church did not just survive, it expanded. Among soldiers, merchants, women, and slaves, its hope took hold. In the empire's most chaotic century, Christianity offered something Rome could not: certainty in suffering, community in alienation, and a promise of life beyond death. What began in obscurity now moved with quiet force toward destiny. And though Rome struck again and again, it could not kill what refused to die. The empire had not yet bowed, but the seed was planted. And soon, the cross would stand where once the eagle reigned. The empire was unraveling. Plague, civil war, and economic collapse had exposed the limits of one man's rule. By the late 3rd century, Rome teetered on the edge of disintegration, its borders pressed by barbarian raids and its throne a revolving door of claimants, each more temporary than the last. Into this maelstrom stepped Diocletian, an unremarkable soldier from the Balkans, whose ambition would forge a new structure from old stones, and whose reforms would buy Rome time, but not permanence. Rising through the ranks of the army during the chaos, Diocletian seized power in 284 CE, after the assassination of Emperor Carus and his son. His ascent was swift, but what followed was methodical. He understood that the empire, in its vastness, could no longer be governed from a single seat. No emperor could be in Britain and Syria at once. No single mind could carry the weight of legions, laws, and threats, both foreign and domestic. So Diocletian did what few emperors dared. He divided his power. He established the tetrarchy, a rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, titled Augusti, and 2 junior colleagues, the Caesars, each governing a quadrant of the empire. Diocletian took the east for himself, the wealthier and more stable half, while his co-Augustus, Maximian, ruled the west. Together they appointed Galerius and Constantius as Caesars, laying the foundation for succession and shared responsibility. It was a vision of balance of control through collaboration. Authority split but not diminished. The empire was now an organism with multiple heads. Capitals multiplied. Nicomedia, Mediolanum, Trier, and Sirmium pulsed with imperial presence. Each ruler bore the same purple, issued similar edicts, and waged war in the name of Rome. The idea was unity through division, an administrative solution to political chaos, and for a time, it worked. Frontiers were secured, rebel generals crushed, tax systems reformed. A new coinage stabilized the faltering economy, and bureaucracy expanded to meet the needs of a compartmentalized state. But beneath the symmetry, cracks remained. The tetrarchy relied on harmony between men, on personal loyalty, stronger than ambition. That illusion would shatter the moment Diocletian stepped down. For in 305 CE, in a gesture rare and almost unfathomable, he voluntarily abdicated, retreating to a palace in Dalmatia to tend his gardens. It was an act of order, but it unleashed chaos. His system depended on successors honoring the balance. They did not. Rivalries erupted as new men claimed power, not by design, but by force. The tetrarchy devolved into civil war, as generals and Caesars turned against one another. Unity cracked beneath the weight of ambition. The empire had been divided to preserve it, but division became its own curse. What Diocletian had built was not a permanent solution, but a fragile scaffolding over a crumbling foundation. Still, his legacy endured. He delayed collapse, restructured the state, and redefined imperial power. Rome would never be ruled the same way again. The illusion of control had held, just long enough for another to rise from the ashes and claim the whole for himself. He was born in the shadow of an empire fraying at the edges yet. He would stitch it back together through vision, war, and a symbol drawn in the sky. Constantine, son of Constantius, rose from a provincial court to reshape the Roman world. Where others had clung to power with bloodied hands, he seized it with a blend of ruthless ambition and divine conviction. In doing so, he changed not only the empire's political future, but its soul. His ascent was forged in fire. After his father's death in 306 CE, the legions at Ebora Commodon York-hailed him as emperor. But the tetrarchy, designed to prevent such unilateral claims, fractured. Rivals emerged, alliances shifted, and civil war consumed the Roman world once again. Over the next 2 decades, Constantine would outlast them all. He fought not only Maxentius and Licinius, but the very system Diocletian had crafted. One by one, his enemies fell, and with each victory, his image grew, no longer just a soldier's son, but a man marked by destiny. The turning point came at the Milvian Bridge in 312. On the eve of battle against Maxentius, Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, with the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign, you will conquer." He ordered the Christian symbol, the Chi, painted on his soldiers' shields. The next day, Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome in triumph, not as a pagan victor, but as a Christian champion. What followed was a revolution cloaked in imperial robes. Constantine did not make Christianity the state religion, but he ended the centuries of persecution with the Edict of Milan. He returned confiscated church property, elevated bishops to positions of influence, and presided over the first great council of Christian unity at Nicaea. For the first time, The empire knelt, not before Jupiter or Mars, but before the cross. And yet, he remained Roman, a builder, a planner, a shaper of cities and systems. Disenchanted with old Rome, bloated with memory and resistant to reform, he sought a new capital closer to the eastern provinces, nearer to the vital grain routes, and untouched by the decadence of the past. He chose Byzantium, an ancient city perched between two worlds. There, he poured imperial treasure into walls, forums, palaces, and churches. In 330, it was rededicated as Nova Roma New Rome, but the world would know it as Constantinople. Constantine ruled until 337, baptized only on his deathbed. He left behind not just an empire, but a legacy and emperor who had dared to merge the sword with the spirit, who had laid the first stones of what would become Byzantium and Christendom alike. He was the last pagan emperor's heir, and the first Christian emperor's founder. Through him, Rome did not fall, it transformed. And in that transformation, the ancient world passed into something new, in a hall hung with purple banners and filled with the murmured prayers of bishops. The empire witnessed a transformation unlike any seen in its long history. The year was 325 CE. The place, Nicaea, a quiet city in Asia Minor. There, under the watchful eye of Emperor Constantine, the Roman world's spiritual and political futures were braided into one. What had once been an underground faith, hunted and martyred, now stood at the center of imperial power. But unity remained elusive. Christianity had spread rapidly, but not uniformly. Across the empire, different communities held different beliefs. Some saw Christ as divine from eternity, others as a created being. The most potent controversy came from a presbyter in Alexandria named Arius, who taught that Jesus, though exalted, was not co-eternal with the Father. There was a time when he was not, Arius saddened. Those words ignited a firestorm. Was Christ truly God, or something lesser, though still glorious? To Constantine, recently victorious and eager to stabilize his realm, division within the church threatened more than doctrine. It threatened order. Faith was now part of the imperial fabric, and theological disputes could no longer remain local squabbles. So, for the first time in history, an emperor summoned the bishops of Christendom to resolve the matter not with the sword, but through debate, persuasion, and vote. Over 300 bishops arrived at Nicaea, many of them scarred by persecution, some literally, their faces marked by old tortures under past emperors. They gathered not as scattered sects, but as the voice of the church, called to define its heart. Constantine, robed in gold, addressed them not as tyrant, but as a servant of divine harmony. He was no theologian, but he understood power and the power of creed. The debates were fierce, words sharpened like blades. Arius defended his views with eloquence and logic, but many in the room feared his ideas would shatter the mystery of Christ into something rational, manageable, and ultimately hollow. Opponents, most notably the young bishop Athanasius, argued for Christ's full divinity begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. When the vote came, Arius stood nearly alone. The council produced a statement, the Nicene Creed, declaring that Jesus Christ was indeed true God from true God. It was not a compromise, it was a declaration. And with it, the Church drew its first universal line in the sand. But Nicaea was not only about doctrine. It marked the dawn of an imperial church, where emperors could convene councils and wield influence over faith. For some, this was a victory of unity. For others, it was the birth of a dangerous marriage between altar and throne. The creed echoed beyond the marble walls of Nicaea, carried on parchment and breath to the corners of the empire. It did not end all heresies, nor silence all dissent, but it gave Christendom a center, a shared foundation. And through it, Rome's empire now baptized in creed and cross-marched into a future it could scarcely imagine. The rivers froze and the forests moved. Across the vast frontiers of the Roman world, the horizon darkened with motion tribes migrating, warriors assembling, entire peoples pushed from their lands by forces greater than themselves. The empire, long protected by walls, borders, and legions, now found those barriers softening. It was not one invasion, but a tide. The names Goths, Vandals, Alans, Huns blurred into a single threat. The world beyond Rome was coming in. The Goths came first, refugees rather than conquerors, fleeing the storm to the east. Behind them rode the Huns, swift and merciless, horsemen from the steppes whose arrival shattered everything in their path. In 376, a vast host of Gothic families, women, children, warriors, arrived at the Danube, begging entry into the empire. Emperor Valens, ruling in the east, allowed them across. But corruption and mismanagement turned welcome into betrayal. Starvation, exploitation, and humiliation followed. The result was revolt. In 378, outside the town of Adrianople, Valens led a Roman army to suppress the Gothic uprising. What followed was not merely a defeat, it was a disaster. The Roman legions were crushed, Valens himself burned in a farmhouse, and the illusion of invincibility evaporated. Never before had such a force of barbarians won so decisively on Roman soil, and never again would the empire fully control its borders. In the west, successive waves of migrants tested imperial resolve. The Rhine froze in 406, and hordes poured across into Gaul. The Vandals would eventually cross into Africa and take Carthage itself. But it was the Visigoths, once wandering, who would strike the deepest blow. Under Alaric, they marched on Rome itself. The Eternal City, untouched by foreign hands for 8 centuries, fell in 410. Though not destroyed, the sack of Rome sent shockwaves across the world. If the capital could be violated, what was left sacred? The East, fortified by wealth and better leadership, managed to hold. Constantinople, ringed with Theodosian walls and protected by bureaucracy as much as by arms, endured. But the West staggered. Emperors became pawns, provinces slipped away, and military authority passed to barbarian generals who commanded the only reliable forces remaining. Rome no longer ruled the world it negotiated, paid off enemies, and watched as territories were carved away. Then came Attila. The scourge of God, as later writers called him, led the Huns into the heart of Europe, extracting tribute, threatening Constantinople, and bringing death in his wake. He advanced to the very gates of Italy, only turning back when famine, disease, and diplomacy intervened. His death in 453 left his empire splintered, but the damage had been done. Rome's foes were no longer on the outside, they were settled within. The old frontier had vanished. The line between Roman and barbarian blurred. Some tribes became allies, others enemies. Some served as foederati, fighting under Roman banners. But all of them Goths, Huns, Vandals reshaped the world Rome once commanded. And from the tremors of their movements, a new age was being born. It did not fall in a single day, nor with a final, decisive blow. The Western Roman Empire died by degrees, strangled by debts, divided by ambitions, and slowly hollowed from within as foreign powers chipped away at its boundaries. What remained by the 5th century was a shadow of its former self, a rotting structure still cloaked in imperial dignity, even as the foundation gave way beneath it. Rome had once stretched from the moors of Britain to the sands of Syria, but now its reach barely extended beyond the Italian heartland. Gaul splintered under pressure from Franks and Burgundians. Spain had been carved into Visigothic and Suevic kingdoms. Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals, whose ships now ruled the western Mediterranean. The old arteries of trade had hardened, and the Roman legions, once feared across the world, now relied on mercenaries and barbarian commanders to enforce imperial will. In 455, disaster struck the heart. The Vandal king Gaiseric, unchallenged at sea, sailed to Italy and entered Rome. The city, already sacked once by the Visigoths, now suffered again, but this time the violence lingered. For 2 weeks, Geiseric's men stripped Rome of its treasures, gold, art, relics, and carried the empress and her daughters away as hostages. The term vandalism would echo from that moment, a word born in the ashes of Roman dignity. Behind the throne, real power drifted into the hands of warlords and court intrigue. The emperors of this final age were often children or figureheads, elevated by generals, who ruled from behind the curtain. One such figure was Ricimer, a Germanic commander who acted as kingmaker, installing and disposing of emperors like chess pieces. The imperial court in Ravenna, isolated and ceremonial, could no longer shape the fate of an empire it barely governed. By 476, the illusion could no longer hold. The boy emperor, Romulus Augustulucius, very name, a cruel echo of the empire's mythical beginning, was placed on the throne as a puppet of the general Orestes. But when Orestes refused to grant land to the barbarian mercenaries he had relied upon, they turned to a leader of their own, Odoacer, a Germanic soldier with no pretense to Roman lineage. He marched on Ravenna, captured Orestes, and deposed the boy emperor. Romulus Augustulus vanished into obscurity. No grand execution, no final defense of Rome, just abdication and exile. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern emperor, but making no claim of his own. There would be no new Western emperor. The line was broken. So ended the Western Roman Empire. Not in apocalyptic ruin, but in quiet dismissal. Its cities still stood, its language still spoken, its laws still echoed, but the empire that had once ruled the world was no more. What followed would be something different. Kingdoms would rise where provinces once lay. The Middle Ages had begun, and Rome would live on not as a government, but as a memory. While the Western Empire faded into fragments, the East endured, not in imitation, but in evolution. From the domes of Constantinople, a different Rome looked out over the world, a Rome clad in silk and incense, guarded by walls and faith, ruled not by senators, but by emperors who bore the weight of Caesar and Christ in equal measure. This was the Byzantine Empire, though it never called itself that. To its people, it was simply Romaean, the Roman Empire, unchanged in soul, even as the world around it transformed. Constantinople had always been more than a city. Founded by Constantine on the Bosporus, it stood as a bridge between continents, cultures, and centuries. Where old Rome had looked westward, this new capital faced east, toward the wealth of Asia and the spiritual heart of Christendom. Protected by massive walls and a cunning bureaucracy, it weathered the storms that broke the West. While barbarian kingdoms rose and fell across Europe, Constantinople thrived trading, legislating, and defending its vast dominions with a blend of pragmatism and divine conviction. Its emperors were no less ambitious than their Western predecessors. Justinian, crowned in the 6th century, dreamed of reconquest. Under his general Belisarius, Roman armies returned to North Africa, Italy, and even parts of Spain. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the empire might be restored. Mosaics in Ravenna glowed with the old imperial light, but wars drained the treasury, and plague hollowed the population. Justinian's vision faltered, but his legacy endured in the laws he codified, shaping legal systems for centuries to come. Culturally, the East diverged. Greek replaced Latin as the language of the court. Theology dominated intellectual life. The emperor was seen not merely as ruler, but as God's vicegerent on earth. In the Hagia Sophia, completed under Justinian's rule, light poured through windows like divine breath, casting golden shadows across marble and mosaic. Here, power was sanctified. Ritual replaced republican memory, and the Roman tradition became inseparable from the Christian one. Enemies remained constant. Sassanid Persians struck from the east, followed by the rising tide of Islam. Arab armies seized the empire's richest provinces, Syria, Egypt, the Levant, yet Constantinople held. The empire shrank, then adapted. Themes replaced provinces. Farmers became soldiers. Bureaucracy tightened, faith deepened. And always, the city stood defiant, luminous, eternal. The West might have seen Rome fall, but in the East, Rome lived on in new colors, new tongues, and new theology. It would not call itself Byzantine until modern historians gave it that name. To its own citizens, it was simply Rome, unchanged and undying. This continuity would last for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West. And when it finally ended, it would do so beneath the crescent banners of a new power. But that was still far off. For now, behind the Theodosian walls, Rome still breathed reborn in marble and fire, scripture and sword. Rome's armies had conquered lands, but it was her laws that conquered time. Long after the legions faded and emperors turned to dust, the voice of Rome continued to echo in courtrooms, in classrooms, and in the minds of those who governed. Her language carried the rhythm of empire. Her laws shaped the very concept of justice. This was Rome's most enduring victory, not power over lands, but over thought. Latin began as the speech of shepherds in the hills of Latium. Yet by the height of the empire, it was the language of scholars, poets, generals, and slaves. It built aqueducts and epic poems alike. Across Gaul, Africa, and Spain, Latin became the common tongue, not by decree, but by utility. It offered clarity, precision, and adaptability. It absorbed what it needed and shed what it didn't. Even as the Western Empire fragmented, Latin endured, shifting into dialects that would one day become the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. But language alone could not bind an empire. For that, Rome crafted law structured, written, and meant to outlast the whims of rulers. In the early Republic, laws were inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum, where even the poorest citizen could see them. The 12 tables were crude by later standards, but they were revolutionary. Law was no longer the private tool of the powerful, but a public standard to which all could appeal. As the Republic matured and the empire expanded, Roman law evolved. Jurists debated principles, emperors issued edicts, and the courts wove custom with innovation. Over time, a vast and intricate legal tradition emerged concerned not only with crime and punishment, but with contracts, property, marriage, and citizenship. The concept of civitas, the rights and responsibilities of Roman identity, became central to imperial life. To be Roman was not a matter of blood, but of law. The culmination came in the 6th century, when Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, undertook a monumental task: to collect, refine, and codify 1,000 years of Roman legal thought. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It was more than a legal manual. It was a distillation of Roman rationality, a monument of intellectual order. For centuries to come, it would guide emperors, popes, and lawyers across continents. In medieval Europe, scholars rediscovered Justinian's code, and from it, the foundations of modern civil law were laid. Today, echoes of Roman law persist in the statutes of France, Germany, Latin America, and in the very idea that law should be rational, consistent, and above the individual ruler. Rome may have fallen, but its words and its laws never did. In the Latin phrases etched in stone, in the clauses of modern constitutions, in the measured arguments of courtrooms, Rome still speaks. Her empire was temporary. Her legacy is eternal. From the ashes of the empire, a new structure rose less visible than legions, but no less powerful. It spoke not with swords, but with scripture. It did not govern cities with walls, but with words. Christianity, once a persecuted sect in the backstreets of the empire, became the spine of a new Roman order. And at its heart, a bishop in Rome would wear not a crown of gold, but the weight of eternity. In the beginning, the church was scattered. Its followers gathered in secret, its leaders met in hiding, and its scriptures passed from hand to hand like treasure. But persecution gave it strength. Martyrs died with courage, and their stories spread across provinces faster than soldiers could extinguish them. The more emperors tried to stamp it out, the more it grew quietly, patiently, until it reached even the palace gates. By the 4th century, the improbable had become reality. Constantine, emperor and warrior, raised the sign of the cross over his banners and marched to victory. Christianity, once nailed to a Roman cross, now stood beside the imperial throne. But with power came complexity. Doctrines diverged. Disputes over Christ's nature, his divinity, and his relationship to the Father threatened to split the new faith before it had fully formed. The answer, true to Roman habits, was organization. The great councils began. Bishops convened in Nicaea, Chalcedon, and beyond, not to debate in chaos, but to define in clarity. They crafted creeds not for one province, but for a whole world. Heresies were named and rejected, orthodoxy declared. The result was more than belief, it was unity. A single church, with shared liturgy and law, spread from Ireland to Egypt. And its structure reflected Rome itself: dioceses, provinces, patriarch's order layered upon order. Amid this hierarchy, one city stood apart. Rome, where Peter had died and Paul had preached, claimed primacy not by force of arms, but by spiritual inheritance. The Bishop of Rome, or Pope, became the guardian of apostolic tradition. Other bishops held sway in ancient cities: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, but none carried the symbolic gravity of the seat of empire. When the Western Empire collapsed, it was the papacy that remained, holding memory, preserving knowledge, and claiming a different kind of sovereignty. Over centuries, popes negotiated with kings, blessed emperors, and clashed with rulers who dared to challenge spiritual authority. They sent missionaries into pagan lands, turning chieftains into Christians and tribes into kingdoms. In time, the church would become not only Rome's heir, but its replacement: spiritual, political, and cultural. Latin, once the language of Caesar, became the tongue of the mass. Roman law shaped canon law. Even the vestments of bishops echoed the robes of forgotten senators. Christianity did not destroy Rome, it transformed it. It took the bones of the empire and breathed new life into them. In basilicas and monasteries, in councils and creeds, the church preserved the order Rome had built and extended it beyond the empire's fall. Where emperors once ruled, now stood shepherds, and their flock would stretch across the ages. Rome never truly died, it was reborn, again and again, not in stone and steel, but in the imagination of those who came after. Long after her legions had disbanded and her emperors lay buried beneath the dust of centuries, the idea of Rome continued to haunt and inspire. It became a ghost that walked through medieval halls, a flame carried by kings and popes, a memory so powerful it could shape identity, authority, and ambition. The city may have crumbled, but Rome lived on, in myth and in longing. In the 8th century, a Frankish warlord named Charles stood before the altar in the old Basilica of St. Peter, and the Bishop of Rome crowned him emperor. The year was 800, and the empire he claimed was Roman, at least in name. Charlemagne had never set foot in Constantinople, nor did he rule the lands of Caesar, but he held something just as potent: legitimacy borrowed from the past. He was no longer merely king of the Franks. He was now emperor of the Romans, crowned in the heart of the old empire by the very church that had survived it. This coronation was more than a ceremony, it was a revival. Charlemagne's court echoed with Latin. His scribes copied Roman texts. His laws drew from Roman tradition. A new empire had risen in the West, clothed in the mantle of the old. The Holy Roman Empire, as it would later be called, was neither holy nor Roman, nor truly an empire, but it endured. clinging to the legacy of a name that still carried the weight of centuries. Centuries later, as medieval Europe stumbled toward the dawn of modernity, the myth of Rome stirred again. In the cities of Italy, where ruins whispered of forgotten grandeur, artists, thinkers, and scholars looked backward to move forward. The Renaissance was not simply a rebirth of art, it was a resurrection of Rome. Latin flowed once more from pens. Statues emerged from marble as if awakened from sleep. Cicero and Virgil found new life in the hands of Florentine humanists. Architecture returned to arches, domes, and columns. Even the very notion of citizenship, of republican virtue, reappeared not in Senate chambers, but in the minds of men dreaming of order and greatness. Later still, kings and emperors across Europe would trace their lineagerial or imagined to Rome. Napoleon crowned himself in Caesar's shadow. Mussolini invoked Roman glory in steel and spectacle. Even America, a republic founded in the Enlightenment, carved its government buildings in neoclassical style and named its Senate in echo of the ancient world. Rome had become more than a place. It was an idea, flexible, powerful, eternal. Each age found in it what it needed: discipline, order, majesty, faith, reason, conquest. The empire may have fallen, but Rome's story never truly ended. It became a dream in stone, a whisper in marble, a fire that flickered through time. And in that dream, emperors still march, senators still speak, and the world still turns beneath the shadow of 7 hills. The Roman Empire carved its memory into stone. Where its armies had passed, roads stretched like arteries through mountains and valleys. Where its emperors ruled, cities rose in concrete and marble, bearing forms that defied time. In the language of architecture, Rome spoke with clarity and power: arches, columns, vaults, and domes standing not just as shelter, but as statements. These structures were not merely buildings. They were declarations of order, permanence, and vision. At the heart of every Roman city stood the Forum, the civic square where justice was administered, commerce was conducted, and temples rose to touch the heavens. Fluted columns surrounded these spaces borrowed from Greek tradition, yet altered and repurposed. The Corinthian, Ionic, and Doric orders became part of a Roman vocabulary, deployed with precision to reflect authority or elegance. But Rome's genius was not in imitation, it was in adaptation. The true revolution was invisible to the eye: concrete. This humble material allowed Roman builders to shape vast interiors and soaring heights. With concrete, they created forms that Greeks had never dared. Arches bore weight with grace. Vaults stretched wide across bathhouses and basilicas. And at the pinnacle of this innovation stood the dome perfected in the Pantheon, a temple to all gods and a monument to engineering audacity. Its oculus, open to the sky, remains a window between the earthly and the divine. Rome was built not only to last, but to impress. The Colosseum, with its labyrinth of chambers and tiered seating, was a statement of imperial control, order even in entertainment. Aqueducts carried water across impossible distances, their graceful spans becoming icons of utility wedded to beauty. Triumphal arches commemorated victory, not just in battle, but over nature, chaos, and time itself. But architecture was only one canvas. Roman art, like its architecture, was a blend of realism and grandeur. Portraits captured the furrowed brows of senators and the serene gaze of goddesses. Mosaics bloomed beneath the feet of emperor, scenes of mythology, conquest, and daily life rendered in stone and color. Frescoes adorned villas, transforming walls into gardens, heavens, or tales from Homer. This aesthetic legacy did not fade with the empire's fall. Instead, it was reborn again and again. Medieval churches borrowed Roman forms to sanctify space. The Renaissance resurrected its lines with new reverence. Baroque artists bent its symmetry into emotional drama. Neoclassical buildings across continents were Roman garb capitals, courthouses, libraries, all echoing a vanished world. Rome did not only build cities, it built ideals. In its art and architecture, the empire offered a vision of civilization ordered, enduring, elevated. Even now, in stone silhouettes against modern skylines, the memory lingers. Through domes that still crown capitals, through columns that still line avenues, Rome dreams on. Its architecture remains not merely as ruin, but as rhythm eternal, imposing, and impossibly alive. In the heart of Italy, the city of Rome stands like a monument in motion. Its stones have witnessed kings, emperors, popes, revolutions, and tourists. Horses gave way to chariots, then to vespers. Yet for all the change, something ancient still lingers. The past is not buried beneath Rome yet, rises up through its streets, whispers from its fountains, and casts shadows across the Tiber. Modern Rome is not a city living beside its ruins. It is a city made of them. The Roman Forum lies quiet now, its columns broken, its temples roofless. But once, these stones heard the voices of Cicero and Caesar. Today, students pass where senators once debated, and pilgrims walk where emperors once paraded in triumph. The Colosseum, stripped of marble and pockmarked by centuries of scavenging, still stands with stubborn dignity. Buses rumble past it, cameras flash, and yet its arches remain solemn sentinels to spectacles long vanished. In the Renaissance, Rome reclaimed its brilliance. Michelangelo climbed its domes, Raphael painted its palaces, and Bramante laid new stones beside the old. The popes of this era saw themselves not as successors to Peter alone, but as heirs to Augustus and Constantine. They built with ambition, draped the city in splendor, and rekindled the flickering idea of Rome as the center of a world. But it was the 19th century that gave Rome a new role, not imperial, not ecclesiastical, but national. As Italy struggled to unify, Rome became both a prize and symbol. In 1870, the last papal troops surrendered to the armies of the new Kingdom of Italy, and the Eternal City became its capital. The Vatican withdrew behind its walls. The Pope became a prisoner in his own domain, while outside, Rome rejoined the world as a modern state. Through 2 world wars, the rise and fall of fascism, and the long march of democracy, Rome remained restless and resilient. Mussolini sought to conjure ancient grandeur through architecture and rhetoric, invoking Caesar while paving boulevards across ruins. But tyranny crumbled as surely as marble, and after the war, a new Rome emerged, scarred, but standing. Today, Rome is at once chaotic and serene, sacred and profane, ancient and alive. Bureaucrats sip espresso beside columns 2 millennia old. Politicians make speeches beneath Renaissance frescoes. Tourists circle the Pantheon, their footsteps echoing those of generations past. Rome no longer rules the world, but its influence lies everywhere in the laws of nations, the vaults of cathedrals, the shapes of cities, and the dreams of those who still believe in order, in endurance, in the weight of history. The city calls itself eternal, not because it never changed, but because, through all change, it endured. Rome may no longer command legions or dictate decrees, but its soul persists in every republic, in every stone arch, and in every echo that drifts through time. Empires do not die as men do. They fade like echoes in long corridors, their presence lingering in stones and stories, in laws and languages. Rome, the greatest of them all, has slept for centuries, not vanished, not forgotten, but dreaming. Beneath the dust of ruins and the gloss of marble halls, its spirit rests, neither fully awake nor truly lost. Once, it ruled from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, its banners raised above deserts and forests, its legions carving roads through the edges of the known world. It called itself eternal, and for a time, that boast seemed justified. But even as Rome reached its height, the seeds of slumber were already sown. No wall can hold forever. No order remains untouched by time. And yet, The Roman dream persists not in conquest, but in continuity, in the way we govern and build, in the ideals we inherit. Its republic haunts every Senate chamber. Its empire shadows every capital built on ambition. The language that once rallied soldiers now whispers in science and scripture. The roads it laid still mark maps. The laws it drafted still shape justice. Its story, vast and broken, still speaks to something deep within the human mind, the desire for permanence in a world of change. To study Rome is not simply to read of battles and emperors, but to hold a mirror to our own civilizations. Rome was flawed, brutal, brilliant. It rose through discipline and vision. It fractured through greed and hubris. It created peace with swords and lost peace through politics. In its glory, it offered unity. In its fall, it offered warning. We walk its streets today, not as Romans, but as heirs. Our cities carry its bones. Our books echo its rhetoric. Our monuments borrow its voice. And in quiet moments beneath the dome of a cathedral, along the curve of an aqueduct, beside a broken statuette, breath returns. Rome, half asleep, still dreams of marble and thunder. All empires sleep. Some do not wake. Others rise again in different shapes, bearing old names with new meanings. Rome has done both. It sleeps in stone but rises in thought. Its flame passes not from torch to torch, but from mind to mind. So let it rest, the empire that once called itself eternal. Let its columns cast long shadows. Let its memory stir gently, not in the clash of arms, but in the quiet recognition that nothing truly great ever disappears. It only sleeps, deep beneath the surface of time, waiting to be remembered. Waiting, perhaps, to be dreamed again.